Imagine discovering that the person you loved never actually existed. Not in the metaphorical sense of a relationship ending, not in the gentle disappointment of realizing someone wasn't who you thought they were, but the stark, disorienting revelation that the personality you fell in love with was a carefully constructed performance, a mask, an illusion designed specifically to trap you. Here's what makes this discovery truly unsettling. By the time you realize it, you've already been systematically trained to doubt your own mind. Your memories have been rewritten. Your perception of reality has been dismantled piece by piece, so subtly that you participated in your own confusion. You find yourself apologizing for things you didn't do, defending someone who's hurting you, unable to trust the evidence of your own senses. And here's the twist that makes this psychological phenomenon so fascinating and so devastating. The person doing this to you may not even fully realize they're doing it. Tonight, we're entering territory that exists at the intersection of personality pathology and psychological warfare. We're exploring narcissistic personality disorder and narcissistic abuse, a pattern so pervasive it affects millions, yet so misunderstood that many who experience it spend years questioning whether it was real. We'll uncover why the most charming people can become the most dangerous, why leaving feels impossible even when staying is destroying you, and why what seems like love can actually be a sophisticated form of psychological manipulation that researchers compare to techniques used in hostage situations and prisoner interrogation. But before we dive deeper, let's establish something crucial. This isn't folklore or pop psychology. Narcissistic personality disorder, as defined in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, 5th edition, text revision, affects between 1 and 2% of the general population, though many experts suggest the true numbers are significantly higher, hidden behind a disorder that, by its very nature, resists recognition and treatment. We're talking about millions of people, and by extension, tens of millions who've been impacted by relationships with them. What you might not know is that there's a profound paradox at the heart of this condition. The person who appears supremely confident, even arrogant, may actually be defending against feelings of worthlessness so intolerable they can't consciously acknowledge them. The person who seems emotionally bulletproof may be so fragile that the slightest criticism triggers psychological earthquakes. And here's where it gets particularly interesting. Researchers have discovered that these aren't two different types of people. They're often the same person, fluctuating between states of grandiosity and vulnerability, creating a psychological whiplash that leaves those close to them perpetually off balance. This isn't a simple story of villains and victims. What we're examining is far more complex and far more unsettling. A personality structure built on fragile foundations that collapses and rebuilds constantly, taking everyone nearby down with it. A cycle of abuse so predictable that researchers can map its phases with disturbing accuracy. And a type of psychological injury that can persist for years after the relationship ends, manifesting in symptoms that clinicians initially struggled to distinguish from actual combat trauma. Tonight, we'll trace the hidden architecture of narcissistic abuse from multiple perspectives. You'll discover why the idealization phase feels more intense than ordinary love, and what that intensity is actually designed to accomplish. You'll learn about the manipulation tactic, so effective, it's been compared to brainwashing techniques, yet so subtle, many victims never consciously recognize it's happening. We'll explore the neurobiological reason why leaving feels as difficult as overcoming an addiction. Because in a very real sense, that's exactly what it is. And we'll reveal something that might surprise you. How childhood experiences that seem completely opposite, excessive praise and severe neglect, can both lead to the same personality disorder through different developmental pathways. How grandiose narcissists and vulnerable narcissists, who appear to be opposites, share an identical core, and why the person who abuses others may genuinely be suffering themselves, though that suffering neither excuses their behavior nor makes them capable of the change survivors desperately hope for. We'll walk through the cycle of narcissistic abuse, idealization, devaluation, and discard, and you'll understand why each phase is psychologically necessary for the narcissist, and why the pattern repeats with such clockwork precision. We'll examine gaslighting, not just as casual dishonesty, but as a systematic dismantling of someone's sense of reality. We'll explore why survivors develop symptoms consistent with complex PTSD, and why traditional relationship counseling not only fails but can actually make narcissistic abuse worse. And we'll talk about something that often gets overlooked: the path to recovery. Because despite the depth of the wound narcissistic abuse creates, healing is possible. Survivors do reclaim their sense of self, rebuild their ability to trust their own perceptions, and move forward. The journey is neither easy nor linear, but understanding the psychological mechanisms at play makes it navigable. Here's what makes this topic both fascinating and essential. Narcissistic abuse operates largely through psychological invisibility. It leaves no physical marks. It often involves no overtly criminal behavior. The abuse is woven through ordinary interactions, hidden in tone of voice, in subtle distortions of reality, in the strategic withholding and granting of affection. By the time victims recognize what's happening, they've often been so thoroughly isolated and confused that seeking help feels impossible. But there's another reason this matters beyond individual relationships. Some researchers have suggested that understanding narcissistic dynamics may help us comprehend larger patterns in our culture. Why certain leaders can maintain devoted followings despite obvious lies. How social media may be amplifying narcissistic traits at a population level, and why our current moment seems particularly hospitable to narcissistic manipulation. Throughout this exploration, we'll maintain scientific rigor while remaining deeply compassionate. Narcissistic personality disorder is a recognized mental health condition, and those who have it are trapped in a personality structure that prevents genuine connection and authentic well-being. This understanding provides context, though it doesn't excuse harmful behavior. For survivors, understanding the psychological architecture of what happened to them is often the first essential step toward healing. So settle in. Let your mind open to what we're about to explore. Whether you're trying to understand someone in your life, recognize patterns from your past, seeking to support someone who's experiencing this, or simply fascinated by the darker corners of human psychology, what we discuss tonight may fundamentally shift how you see relationships, power, and the hidden mechanisms of personality. The person who never existed is about to become visible. Let's begin. Section 1. Understanding Narcissistic Personality Disorder. To understand narcissistic abuse, we must first understand narcissism itself, not the casual, everyday narcissism we all possess to some degree, that healthy self-interest that helps us navigate the world, but pathological narcissism, the kind that becomes rigid, pervasive, and ultimately destructive. But here's where the story takes an unexpected turn. What if I told you that the defining feature of pathological narcissism isn't actually excessive self-love, but rather its opposite? This revelation emerged gradually as psychoanalysts and researchers accumulated decades of clinical observations. The term narcissism originates from the Greek myth of Narcissus, a young man so enamored with his own reflection that he remained transfixed, unable to move, eventually dying at the water's edge. For years, this seemed an apt metaphor. Narcissists appeared to love themselves too much. But modern research suggests something far more complex and paradoxical. What clinicians discovered through careful observation and therapeutic work is that beneath the grandiose exterior lies profound fragility. The apparent self-love is actually a desperate defense against feelings of worthlessness so intolerable that the person cannot consciously acknowledge them. This insight, developed most notably through the work of psychoanalysts like Heinz Kohut and Otto Kernberg in the mid-20th century, fundamentally changed how we understand the disorder. Sigmund Freud was among the first to bring narcissism into psychological discourse. In 1914, he wrote an essay called On Narcissism, an Introduction, in which he distinguished between primary narcissism, a normal developmental stage in infancy, and secondary narcissism, a return to self-absorption that could become pathological. Freud theorized that narcissism arose when development proceeded wrongly, when the individual remained fixated on the self, instead of developing the capacity for genuine connection with others. The concept evolved significantly throughout the 20th century, but it wasn't until Kohut's self-psychology and Kernberg's object relations models emerged in the 1960s and 70s that clinicians began to fully appreciate the defensive nature of narcissistic grandiosity. Based on extensive therapeutic work with patients, both theorists proposed, through different frameworks, that pathological narcissism develops as a response to early emotional wounds. Though they disagreed about the precise nature of those wounds and the mechanisms involved. The current diagnostic criteria for narcissistic personality disorder, as outlined in the DSM-5-TR, require a pervasive pattern of grandiosity, need for admiration, and lack of empathy, beginning by early adulthood and present across various contexts. To meet diagnostic criteria, an individual must exhibit at least 5 of 9 specified characteristics. These characteristics include a grandiose sense of self-importance, where the person exaggerates their achievements and talents and expects to be recognized as superior, even without accomplishments, to warrant such recognition. They may spend considerable time fantasizing about unlimited success, power, brilliance, beauty, or ideal love. There's often a belief that they are special and unique and can only be understood by, or should associate with, other special or high-status people or institutions. Individuals with narcissistic personality disorder require excessive admiration. This isn't simply enjoying compliments or appreciation. It's a constant, insatiable need for others to affirm their specialness. They may fish for compliments constantly, become irritable or dejected when praise is not forthcoming, and orient much of their behavior around eliciting admiration from others. A sense of entitlement pervades their interactions. They have unreasonable expectations of especially favorable treatment or automatic compliance with their expectations. They may become angry or contemptuous when they don't receive special treatment, when they have to wait in line like everyone else, when their needs aren't prioritized above others. In their mind, their specialness should grant them access, privilege, and deference. Interpersonally, those with narcissistic personality disorder are exploitative. They take advantage of others to achieve their own ends, viewing people more as objects or tools than as individuals with their own needs, feelings, and rights. A relationship is evaluated based on what it provides them: admiration, status, practical benefits, sexual gratification. When someone stops serving their needs, they may be discarded without hesitation or remorse. Perhaps most centrally, there is an impaired capacity for empathy. The DSM-5-TR describes this as an unwillingness to recognize or identify with the feelings and needs of others, though research has revealed something fascinating and unsettling. Here's the twist. Narcissists may not lack empathy in the way we typically imagine. Studies using neuroimaging and psychological testing have uncovered a crucial distinction. Evidence suggests that individuals with narcissistic personality disorder may have intact cognitive empathy, the intellectual ability to understand what others are feeling, but impaired affective empathy, the capacity to actually feel with others, to be emotionally moved by their experience. This finding, which emerged from research in the 2010s, examining brain activation patterns, helps explain a deeply disturbing aspect of narcissistic abuse. A narcissist can understand perfectly well that you're sad, hurt, or frightened. They can read your emotional state with sometimes uncanny accuracy. But this understanding is cold, analytical, useful primarily for manipulation rather than connection. Your sadness doesn't touch them emotionally in the way it would touch most people. This could explain why they can cause tremendous pain while seeming genuinely puzzled about why you're upset. They understand intellectually but don't feel the weight of your distress. Envy is common, though it may be expressed in two seemingly opposite ways. Some individuals with narcissistic personality disorder openly envy others who have what they want, becoming bitter and resentful about others' success, beauty, relationships, or possessions. Others project their envy outward, believing that others are envious of them, that people are jealous of their success or attractiveness or special qualities. This projected envy can make them paranoid and suspicious, always on guard against those who they believe want to tear them down. Finally, there's a quality of arrogance or haughtiness in their behaviors and attitudes. They may be dismissive, condescending, or openly scornful toward those they perceive as inferior, which is often most people. Their facial expressions, tone of voice, and body language communicate superiority and contempt. Reading through these criteria, it's easy to form an image of someone obviously grandiose, someone whose narcissism is on full display. The bragging executive, the vain celebrity, the domineering parent who makes every conversation about themselves. And certainly, such presentations exist. But the reality of narcissistic personality disorder is far more variable and complex. Some individuals with this diagnosis present in ways that seem, on the surface, quite different from the DSM criteria. They may appear insecure rather than grandiose, anxious rather than haughty, victimized rather than entitled. This has led researchers and clinicians to recognize that narcissism doesn't manifest in a single form. Instead, there appear to be at least two distinct presentations, often called grandiose narcissism and vulnerable narcissism, which we'll explore in depth shortly. Prevalence estimates for narcissistic personality disorder vary considerably depending on the population studied and the assessment methods used, a variation that itself tells us something important about the disorder. In community samples, rates typically fall between 1 and 2%. However, in clinical settings, the rates jump dramatically. Among outpatients seeking mental health treatment, studies have found rates ranging from 1.3 to 20%, with some research suggesting that narcissistic personality disorder may be present in up to 20% of patients in private practice outpatient settings. This wide range reflects both genuine variation across different treatment settings and methodological differences in how the disorder is assessed. But it may also reflect something inherent to NPD itself. People with the disorder rarely seek treatment specifically for narcissistic traits, so they appear in clinical populations primarily when comorbid conditions drive them to seek help, which could lead to both underdiagnosis in some settings and concentration in others. Narcissistic personality disorder appears to be more common in men than in women, with studies suggesting approximately 7.7% prevalence in men compared to 4.8% in women. However, these numbers warrant careful interpretation. Gender differences in how narcissistic traits are expressed, socialized, and perceived may influence both the actual development of the disorder and its recognition by clinicians. It's plausible, based on clinical observations, that women with narcissistic traits may be more likely to receive diagnoses of histrionic or borderline personality disorder rather than narcissistic personality disorder, reflecting both potential, genuine, phenomenological differences in presentation and possible diagnostic bias. The diagnostic criteria themselves, which emphasize overt grandiosity and dominance, may better capture typically masculine expressions of narcissism, while missing more covert or relationally focused variants that might be more common in women. It's crucial to understand that narcissistic personality disorder exists on a spectrum. At one end, we have subclinical narcissistic traits that many people possess to varying degrees. Most of us have moments of grandiosity, times when we need validation, situations where we struggle with empathy. These traits become pathological when they're rigid, pervasive, and cause significant impairment in functioning or subjective distress. Between normal narcissistic traits and full narcissistic personality disorder lies what researchers call pathological narcissism, a broader construct that captures difficulties maintaining realistic and stable self-esteem. People with pathological narcissism may not meet full criteria for the disorder, but their narcissistic features cause problems in their relationships, work, and sense of well-being. The concept of pathological narcissism helps us recognize that personality pathology doesn't always fit neatly into diagnostic boxes. It's also important to note that the presentation of narcissistic personality disorder can change across the lifespan. Narcissistic traits often become more pronounced during adolescence and early adulthood, then gradually diminish as people age. However, for those with the full disorder, improvement tends to be slow and gradual. Some research suggests that the most overt, grandiose behaviors may decrease with age, but underlying fragility, hypersensitivity, and interpersonal difficulties often persist. Narcissistic personality disorder rarely occurs in isolation. High rates of comorbidity, the co-occurrence of multiple mental health conditions, are common. Mood disorders, particularly depression, frequently accompany narcissistic personality disorder. This isn't surprising when we consider the fragile self-esteem and dependence on external validation that characterizes the condition. When the narcissistic supply, that constant stream of admiration and attention they require, runs dry, or when they experience significant narcissistic injuries like criticism or failure, depression can set in. Anxiety disorders also commonly co-occur with narcissistic personality disorder. The need to maintain a grandiose self-image while harboring deep insecurity creates considerable internal tension. Social anxiety may emerge, not from a general fear of social situations, but from a hypersensitivity to evaluation and a fear that others will see through the grandiose facade to the inadequate self beneath. Substance use disorders are significantly elevated among individuals with narcissistic personality disorder. Alcohol and drugs may serve multiple functions, regulating the emotional dysregulation that underlies narcissistic personality organization, enhancing grandiose feelings, numbing feelings of emptiness or shame, or simply serving as another form of self-focused indulgence. Unfortunately, substance use often exacerbates the destructive behaviors associated with narcissism, lowering inhibitions around exploitative or aggressive interpersonal conduct. Other personality disorders frequently overlap with narcissistic personality disorder as well. Antisocial features, including disregard for others' rights, lack of remorse, and manipulative behavior, can co-occur, particularly in what some researchers call malignant narcissism, a particularly destructive combination of narcissistic grandiosity, antisocial behavior, ego-syntonic aggression, and paranoid traits. Borderline features, including emotional instability and fears of abandonment, may also be present, particularly in more vulnerable narcissistic presentations. This comorbidity presents challenges both for diagnosis and treatment. When someone presents to a clinician with depression, anxiety, or substance use problems, the underlying personality disorder may not be immediately apparent. The individual may be seeking help for the symptoms that cause them distress, while remaining unaware of or resistant to recognizing the deeper personality patterns that contribute to their difficulties. In fact, one of the most significant challenges with narcissistic personality disorder is that individuals with the condition rarely seek treatment for the disorder itself. This isn't simply resistance or stubbornness. It's inherent to the disorder's structure. The defensive grandiosity that characterizes narcissism serves to protect against feelings of inadequacy shame, and worthlessness. Acknowledging that one has a personality disorder, admitting that something is fundamentally wrong with how one relates to oneself and others, threatens this defensive structure. It's ego-dystonic in the extreme, completely at odds with the narcissistic person's sense of themselves as special, superior, and beyond ordinary human flaws. When individuals with narcissistic personality disorder do enter treatment, it's often because of external pressure. A spouse threatens to leave unless they get help. An employer mandates therapy after interpersonal conflicts at work. Legal consequences loom. Or they're seeking help for a comorbid condition, for their depression or anxiety or substance use, without recognizing the personality patterns beneath. Even in therapy, maintaining engagement proves difficult. The therapeutic relationship itself challenges narcissistic defenses. The therapist's interpretations may feel like criticism. Their empathy may be experienced as condescension. Their boundaries may provoke rage. Individuals with narcissistic personality disorder may idealize the therapist initially, hoping they'll provide the perfect mirroring and admiration they crave, then become devastated and enraged when the therapist fails to meet these unrealistic expectations. They may drop out of treatment prematurely, seek multiple second opinions, or remain in therapy for years without meaningful change. Understanding narcissistic personality disorder requires holding multiple truths simultaneously. Yes, individuals with this condition can cause tremendous harm to others through exploitation, manipulation, and emotional abuse. And yes, they themselves are suffering, trapped in a personality structure that prevents genuine connection, stable self-esteem, and authentic well-being. These truths don't cancel each other out. They coexist, reflecting the complex reality of personality pathology. Section 2. The two faces of narcissism. For decades, clinicians observed something puzzling about their patients with narcissistic features. Some fit the textbook description perfectly: overtly grandiose, supremely confident, dismissive of others, their narcissism on full display. But others presented quite differently. They seemed anxious, even depressed. They were hypersensitive to criticism, easily wounded, socially avoidant. Yet beneath these surface differences, something fundamental seemed similar. Both groups struggled with fragile self-esteem that depended heavily on external validation. Both had difficulty with genuine empathy. Both showed a certain self-absorption, an inability to truly see others as separate beings with their own valid needs and feelings. This clinical observation eventually led to a crucial recognition. Narcissists could manifest in at least two distinct ways. Researchers began distinguishing between grandiose narcissism and vulnerable narcissism, sometimes also called overt and covert narcissism, or thick-skinned and thin-skinned narcissism. Understanding these two presentations is essential to grasping the full picture of narcissistic personality pathology and narcissistic abuse. Grandiose narcissism is what most people think of when they hear the word narcissist. These individuals exude confidence and self-assurance. They're extroverted, socially bold, often charming. They dominate conversations, steering topics back to their accomplishments, their experiences, their opinions. They present themselves as special, superior, exceptional. Their grandiosity isn't usually hidden or subtle. It's part of how they move through the world. In social situations, grandiose narcissists often become the center of attention. They may be entertaining, charismatic, drawing others into their orbit. They tell the best stories, have the most extreme experiences, know the most important people. Their self-promotion can be remarkably effective, at least initially. Many grandiose narcissists achieve considerable success in careers that reward confidence, assertiveness, and self-promotion. They may rise to leadership positions, become successful in sales or entrepreneurship, or achieve recognition in fields that value bold self-presentation. Emotionally, grandiose narcissists tend to display high self-esteem, at least on the surface. They seem untroubled by self-doubt, confident in their superiority. When challenged or criticized, they may respond with anger, dismissiveness, or counterattack rather than shame or withdrawal. They're quick to devalue those who question them, protecting their grandiose self-image by diminishing others. In relationships, grandiose narcissists are often exploitative and manipulative, viewing partners, friends, and colleagues primarily in terms of what they provide: admiration, status, practical benefits, or simply an audience. They may be unfaithful, entitled about others' time and resources, and indifferent to the pain they cause. When someone stops serving their needs or dares to assert their own needs and boundaries, they may be discarded without genuine remorse, replaced by a new source of narcissistic supply. Research on grandiose narcissism has identified several key personality correlates. Grandiose narcissists score high on measures of extroversion, particularly the facets related to assertiveness, excitement-seeking, and positive emotions. They score high on antagonism, that dimension of personality characterized by manipulation, deceitfulness, grandiosity, and callousness. They typically report high self-esteem and low neuroticism, at least on self-report measures, suggesting a relative absence of anxiety, depression, and vulnerability. Though, as we'll see, this apparent emotional stability may be more defensive than genuine. Vulnerable narcissism presents quite differently on the surface. These individuals appear insecure rather than confident, anxious rather than boldly assertive. They're often introverted, socially withdrawn, seemingly humble or self-deprecating. They may present as victims, people who have been misunderstood, underappreciated, treated unfairly by an unjust world. Yet beneath this vulnerable exterior lies the same core narcissistic features: a grandiose sense of self, intense need for validation, hypersensitivity to criticism, and impaired empathy. The grandiosity of vulnerable narcissists is often hidden, expressed more in fantasy than in overt behavior. They may harbor secret beliefs about their specialness, their unrecognized genius, their hidden superiority. They feel entitled to admiration and recognition, even though they may not have accomplishments to warrant it. When this recognition doesn't come, when the world fails to see their specialness, they feel deeply wounded, resentful, unfairly treated. Vulnerable narcissists are exquisitely sensitive to criticism, evaluation, and social comparison. Any hint of disapproval or any situation that threatens their grandiose self-image can trigger intense shame, anxiety, or rage. Unlike grandiose narcissists, who may aggressively counterattack when criticized, vulnerable narcissists are more likely to withdraw, sulk, or engage in passive-aggressive retaliation. They may ruminate endlessly over perceived slights, building elaborate narratives about how others have wronged them. In relationships, vulnerable narcissists can be just as destructive as their grandiose counterparts, though the dynamics differ. They may be clingy and dependent, demanding constant reassurance and attention. They're hypersensitive to any hint of abandonment or rejection. They may play the victim, manipulating through guilt and pity rather than charm and boldness. Their neediness can be overwhelming, draining those around them. Yet despite appearing to need others intensely, they still lack genuine empathy. Their focus remains primarily on their own needs, their own wounds, their own sense of being underappreciated or mistreated. Research on vulnerable narcissism reveals a distinct personality profile compared to grandiose narcissism. Vulnerable narcissists score high on neuroticism, that broad dimension of personality associated with anxiety, depression, emotional instability, and vulnerability to stress. They score high on antagonism, like grandiose narcissists, but their antagonistic features are expressed differently, more through resentfulness, suspiciousness, and passive hostility than through overt dominance and exploitation. They typically report low self-esteem, though this may coexist with hidden grandiose fantasies. They score low on extroversion, tending toward introversion and social inhibition. For many years, researchers treated grandiose and vulnerable narcissism as essentially independent dimensions. Studies using large community samples often found little to no correlation between measures of grandiose and vulnerable narcissism. This suggested that these might be two relatively distinct conditions, perhaps even different disorders, that happen to share the narcissism label. But clinicians kept reporting something different. They observed that many of their patients with significant narcissistic pathology showed both grandiose and vulnerable features, sometimes alternating between them, sometimes expressing them simultaneously in different contexts. A patient might present as boldly grandiose in professional settings, but become vulnerable and wounded in intimate relationships. Or they might cycle between states of inflation and deflation, between feelings of superiority and feelings of inadequacy and shame. This clinical observation eventually led researchers to investigate more carefully. Recent studies have revealed what's called a non-linear relationship between grandiose and vulnerable narcissism. At low to moderate levels of grandiose narcissism, there's little relationship with vulnerable narcissism. People who are somewhat narcissistic in a grandiose way aren't particularly vulnerable. But at high levels of grandiose narcissism, vulnerability increases dramatically. Those with the most pronounced grandiose traits also tend to show significant vulnerable features. Here's the revelation that changes everything. The supremely confident narcissist and the wounded, vulnerable narcissist aren't different people. They're often the same person at different moments. This finding, which emerged from meta-analyses, combining data from multiple studies in the early 2020s, suggests that what appears on the surface as stable, arrogant grandiosity may actually be protecting against intense vulnerability lying just beneath. The grandiosity serves a defensive function, covering over deep feelings of inadequacy and worthlessness. When this defense is threatened, when the grandiose self can't be maintained, the vulnerable features emerge. Think about what this means for relationships. You're not dealing with someone whose personality shifts inexplicably between confidence and insecurity. You're dealing with someone whose apparent confidence is a thin shell over profound fragility. This could explain the Jekyll and Hyde quality many survivors describe. One moment supremely arrogant, the next devastatingly wounded by minor slights. These aren't mood swings or manipulation. They're the inevitable fluctuation of an unstable defensive structure constantly collapsing and rebuilding. Some researchers have proposed thinking of grandiose and vulnerable narcissism not as separate subtypes, but as different regulatory strategies for managing a core problem. Chronically unstable self-esteem and an inability to maintain a realistic, integrated sense of self. Grandiose narcissism represents what might be called a hawkish strategy: bold, aggressive self-promotion, extraction of admiration and validation from others, and dismissal or devaluation of anything that threatens self-esteem. Vulnerable narcissism represents a dovish strategy: withdrawal, hypersensitivity to threats, rumination, and seeking sympathy and validation through victimhood. Both strategies aim to regulate self-esteem and protect against feelings of shame and inadequacy, but they do so through different means. And importantly, individuals may shift between these strategies depending on circumstances. When feeling confident and resourced, when external validation is flowing freely, grandiose features may predominate. When stressed, depleted, or facing significant narcissistic injury, vulnerable features may emerge. Research using ecological momentary assessment, where individuals report on their experiences multiple times throughout the day, has revealed considerable fluctuation in narcissistic states, even within a single day. People high in dispositional narcissism may experience swings between grandiosity and vulnerability, between feeling superior and feeling inadequate, between confidence and shame. These fluctuations are particularly pronounced for those high in grandiose narcissism, supporting the idea that grandiosity is often a defense against underlying vulnerability. There's also evidence for a mixed or malignant subtype that combines the most destructive features of both presentations. Individuals with this profile show both the overt grandiosity, exploitation, and lack of empathy of grandiose narcissism, and the rage, suspiciousness, and vindictiveness more characteristic of vulnerable narcissism. When combined with antisocial features like disregard for others' rights and absence of remorse, and paranoid features like suspiciousness and holding grudges, the result can be particularly dangerous. This malignant narcissism, a term popularized by psychoanalyst Erich Fromm and later elaborated by Otto Kernberg, represents perhaps the most destructive form of narcissistic pathology. Understanding the grandiose and vulnerable presentations of narcissism has important implications for recognizing narcissistic abuse. The obvious grandiose narcissist may be easier to identify by their exploitation, their arrogance, Their dismissiveness are more visible. But vulnerable narcissists can be just as abusive, and their abuse may be harder to recognize because it's cloaked in apparent weakness or victimhood. The vulnerable narcissist may manipulate through guilt rather than intimidation. They may control through emotional neediness rather than overt dominance. They may abuse through passive aggression, silent treatments, or by making their partner responsible for managing their fragile emotional state. Their hypersensitivity means that anything can be interpreted as an attack, that normal boundaries or requests can trigger intense reactions. Yet they still lack genuine empathy for their partner's experience, remaining primarily focused on their own needs and wounds. Moreover, the fluctuation between grandiose and vulnerable states can be profoundly destabilizing for those in relationships with narcissists. One moment, the narcissist is confident, charismatic, making their partner feel special through association with their apparent specialness. The next, they're wounded, deflated, requiring constant reassurance and emotional labor. This instability, this never knowing which version you'll encounter, creates anxiety and hypervigilance in partners and family members. The existence of these two presentations also helps explain why relationships with narcissists often involve such extreme cycles. The idealization phase, which we'll explore in depth later, tends to feature more grandiose presentation. Confidence, charm, bold romantic gestures, promises of a special future together. The devaluation phase often involves shifts toward more vulnerable features. Rage at perceived abandonment, accusations of being unsupported or unappreciated, sulking and silent treatments when needs aren't met. But these aren't necessarily different people. They're different states of the same narcissistic personality structure, different strategies for managing the same core instability. Research continues to refine our understanding of narcissistic presentations. Some models propose a three-factor structure: exhibitionistic grandiosity, characterized by attention-seeking and self-aggrandizement; narcissistic vulnerability, characterized by shame, proneness, and hypersensitivity; and antagonistic entitlement, characterized by exploitation and lack of empathy. This three-factor model suggests that while grandiosity and vulnerability may be relatively distinct, both are undergirded by a common core of entitlement and antagonism. What becomes clear is that narcissism is not a unitary phenomenon. It's a complex constellation of traits, defenses, and strategies that can manifest in various ways. Some presentations are more obvious, others more hidden. Some are more characterized by bold self-promotion, others by wounded victimhood. But at the core, there's a shared pattern: fragile, unrealistic self-esteem, intense need for external validation, impaired empathy and exploitation of others in service of maintaining a grandiose self-image. For those trying to understand whether someone in their life has narcissistic features, recognizing both presentations is crucial. Don't assume that someone can't be narcissistic because they don't fit the stereotypical image of the arrogant, grandiose narcissist. Look beneath surface presentations to the underlying patterns. Is there a sense of specialness or entitlement, even if expressed through victimhood rather than superiority? Is there hypersensitivity to criticism or perceived slights? Is there a pattern of relationships being primarily about getting their needs met? Is there genuine empathy for others? Or primarily self-focus, dressed up in apparently caring language? And if you're recovering from a relationship with a narcissist, understanding these two faces can help make sense of confusing experiences. The person who seemed so confident and special in the beginning, but became needy and accusatory later, wasn't necessarily deceiving you intentionally. They were showing you different facets of the same personality structure, different strategies for managing the same core instability. Neither version was the real person. Both were expressions of narcissistic organization. Understanding this can help you stop searching for the good version to return, can help you recognize that the relationship was never what it appeared to be, can help you move forward in your healing. Section 3. Origins and Development. How does someone develop narcissistic personality disorder? What combination of factors leads to this particular organization of personality? These questions have occupied researchers and clinicians for decades, and while we don't have complete answers, a picture has emerged of complex, multifactorial causation involving genetics, neurobiology, developmental experiences, and broader cultural context. Let's start by acknowledging a fundamental truth. Personality disorders don't arise from a single cause. They're not like infectious diseases where you can identify a specific pathogen or genetic conditions with a single causative mutation. Instead, personality disorders emerge from the interaction of multiple risk factors operating across different levels: biological predispositions, early attachment relationships, childhood adversity, parenting styles, temperament, cultural context, and chance events that shape development in particular directions. The genetic contribution to narcissistic personality disorder appears to be significant, though research in this area remains limited compared to other mental health conditions. Twin studies and family studies suggest that personality traits related to narcissism, particularly aspects like entitlement, grandiosity, and low empathy, show moderate heritability. Estimates suggest that genetic factors may account for somewhere between 25 to 40% of the variance in narcissistic traits, though these numbers should be interpreted cautiously given the complexity of measuring personality. What's inherited isn't narcissistic personality disorder per se, but rather temperamental traits that may increase vulnerability to developing the disorder under certain environmental conditions. An infant might be born with a temperament characterized by high sensation-seeking, low effortful control, or reduced capacity for empathic distress. These temperamental features don't cause narcissism directly, but they may interact with environmental factors to increase risk. A child with high baseline grandiosity who receives excessive praise and insufficient limits might develop more pronounced narcissistic features than a temperamentally similar child raised with more balanced feedback and appropriate boundaries. Neurobiological research on narcissistic personality disorder has revealed structural and functional differences in brain regions involved in self-processing, empathy, and emotional regulation. Neuroimaging studies have found alterations in the thickness and volume of certain brain areas, particularly the insula and anterior cingulate cortex, regions involved in processing emotions and empathy. Some research suggests reduced gray matter volume in the anterior insula, which correlates with measures of narcissistic traits and empathic deficits. Functional brain imaging studies have shown differences in how individuals with narcissistic features respond to social feedback. When receiving negative evaluations or social rejection, they show heightened activity in brain regions associated with distress and anger, but reduced activity in areas associated with empathy and mentalizing, the capacity to think about others' mental states. When receiving praise or recognition, they show exaggerated activation in reward-related brain circuits, consistent with their heightened sensitivity to narcissistic supply. These neurobiological differences raise complex questions about causation. Are these brain differences a cause of narcissistic personality patterns? Or do they develop as a result of those patterns? The answer is likely both. Genetic and early environmental factors may shape brain development in ways that increase narcissistic vulnerability. Then, as narcissistic patterns of thinking and behavior become established, they may further alter brain structure and function through neuroplasticity, the brain's capacity to change in response to experience. But perhaps the most extensively studied contributors to narcissistic personality disorder are developmental and environmental factors, particularly childhood experiences. Two psychoanalytic theories have dominated thinking about the developmental origins of narcissism, and while they differ in their emphasis, both point to disturbances in early parent-child relationships. Otto Kernberg's object relations model emphasizes the role of cold, rejecting, or emotionally unavailable parenting, often combined with a confusing mixture of admiration or special treatment. In Kernberg's framework, the child experiences the parent as hypercritical and devaluing, never satisfied with the child's actual self. Simultaneously, the parent may convey that the child is special or superior in some way, perhaps as an extension of the parent's own narcissism. The child can't integrate these contradictory experiences into a coherent sense of self. To defend against the pain of rejection and the sense of being fundamentally defective, the child creates what Kernberg calls a pathological grandiose self. This defensive structure fuses idealized images of the self with idealized images of others, creating a sense of specialness and superiority. Simultaneously, all the vulnerable, needy, ordinary aspects of the self and others are split off, devalued, and denied. This grandiose self provides protection against devastating feelings of inferiority and worthlessness, but it's a brittle, unrealistic structure that requires constant validation from others to maintain. Heinz Kohut's self-psychology model takes a different view, emphasizing failures in empathic attunement rather than rejection. According to Kohut, healthy narcissism in infancy needs to be gradually transformed into mature self-esteem through appropriate parental responses. The child needs mirroring, having their emerging self recognized, validated, and celebrated in age-appropriate ways. They also need idealization, the opportunity to admire and internalize the strength and calmness of idealized parental figures. When parents fail to provide adequate mirroring, when they're emotionally unavailable, when they don't see and respond to the child's actual self, the child's normal narcissism doesn't mature. The child remains stuck in an archaic narcissistic state, perpetually seeking the mirroring they never received, attempting to get from others what parents failed to provide. Similarly, when parents fail to serve as adequate figures for idealization, perhaps because they're chaotic, frightening, or unreliable, the child can't internalize a sense of inner strength and calm, remaining dependent on external sources of stability and validation. More recent research has moved beyond single-factor theories to examine multiple developmental pathways to narcissistic pathology. Contemporary studies have revealed something that initially seems paradoxical. Completely opposite childhood experiences can lead to the same disorder. This is one of the most counterintuitive findings in narcissism research. How can both excessive praise and severe neglect produce the same personality structure? The answer appears to lie not in the specific experiences themselves, but in what they have in common. Both fail to provide genuine empathic attunement to the child's authentic self. Grandiose narcissism has been linked in research to parental overvaluation. Children told repeatedly that they're more special than others, entitled to favorable treatment, superior in intelligence or talent. This pattern, documented in studies over the past 2 decades, makes intuitive sense. The child internalizes the parent's inflated view. But here's the crucial detail researchers discovered. Parental overvaluation appears to lead to grandiose narcissistic traits, primarily when it's not accompanied by genuine warmth and empathic attunement. When parents praise a child excessively but in a cold or instrumental way, using the child as an extension of their own narcissistic needs, the praise doesn't nourish healthy self-esteem. Instead, it creates a grandiose but fragile sense of self that depends on continued external validation. The child learns they're valued not for who they authentically are, but for maintaining a special, superior image. Vulnerable narcissism, conversely, has been more consistently linked in research to childhood adversity, neglect, and abuse. Studies examining adverse childhood experiences have found strong associations between physical abuse, emotional neglect, childhood trauma, and vulnerable narcissistic features. Children who experience chronic invalidation, rejection, or abuse may develop compensatory, grandiose fantasies to manage feelings of worthlessness, but their narcissism manifests more in vulnerability, shame, proneness, and hypersensitivity than in overt grandiosity. What both pathways share, we can infer from these research patterns, is a fundamental failure to see and respond to the child's authentic emotional self. Whether through praise that's conditional on maintaining specialness, or through neglect and abuse that communicates worthlessness, the child learns that their true self is not acceptable. Only a constructed self, either inflated or deflated depending on circumstances, receives any form of recognition. Sexual abuse in childhood has been specifically linked to narcissistic traits, with some studies suggesting that dissociation may mediate this relationship. When children experience the overwhelming violation of sexual abuse, they may dissociate, fragmenting their sense of self as a way to survive the experience. This fragmentation and the need to manage overwhelming shame may contribute to narcissistic personality organization. where the self is organized around maintaining a grandiose image to defend against intolerable feelings of degradation and powerlessness. Importantly, research has increasingly recognized that adverse childhood experiences don't lead to narcissistic personality disorder in isolation. Rather, it's often a particular combination of experiences that creates risk. A child might experience both overvaluation in some domains, like intelligence or talent, and neglect or abuse in emotional needs. They might be praised for achievements while being rejected when showing vulnerability or need. They might be treated as special within the family, but face rejection or bullying in peer relationships. This combination can be particularly toxic. The child internalizes messages that their worth depends on being special, superior, exceptional, yet simultaneously experiences profound failures in empathic attunement and emotional safety. They learn that ordinary human needs and vulnerabilities are unacceptable, that only a grandiose self is lovable or valuable. But the grandiose self they construct is hollow, without genuine substance, because it's built on a foundation of hidden shame and unmet needs. Parenting styles more broadly contribute to narcissistic development. Authoritarian parenting, characterized by high demands and low responsiveness, may contribute particularly when combined with conditional regard, where the child feels loved only when meeting parental expectations. Permissive or indulgent parenting, where the child receives little structure or limit setting while being excessively praised, may also contribute, particularly when the praise is unconnected to genuine achievement or effort. Perhaps paradoxically, both too little and too much parental involvement can create risk. Parents who are emotionally unavailable, neglectful, or rejecting fail to provide the secure base and empathic attunement children need. But parents who are over-involved, who treat the child as an extension of themselves, who live vicariously through the child's achievements, who can't tolerate the child's separateness or agency, also undermine healthy personality development. The phenomenon of parentification, where children are forced into caretaking roles for their parents, appears particularly relevant. Children who must manage their parents' emotional needs, who learn early that relationships are about meeting others' needs at the expense of their own, who discover that their worth depends on what they provide to others, may develop narcissistic defenses as a way to manage the anger, resentment, and sense of emptiness this creates. Cultural factors also play a role in narcissistic personality development. Research comparing narcissism across cultures has found higher levels of narcissistic traits in individualistic cultures compared to collectivistic cultures. Societies that emphasize personal achievement, individual rights, self-promotion, and competitive success may cultivate narcissistic features more readily than societies that emphasize community, interdependence, harmony, and collective welfare. This doesn't mean that narcissistic personality disorder doesn't exist in collectivistic cultures, but its expression may differ. The overt self-promotion characteristic of grandiose narcissism in Western individualistic contexts might manifest differently in cultures where such behavior is less socially acceptable. The disorder may be expressed more through family status, through achievement that brings honor to the family, or through more covert presentations. Social changes over recent decades may be influencing narcissism at a population level. Some researchers have argued that Western societies, particularly the United States, have become more narcissistic over time, with generational increases in narcissistic traits. They point to cultural shifts emphasizing self-esteem over self-discipline, participation trophies, social media's cultivation of curated self-presentation, and the valorization of celebrities famous for being famous rather than for genuine accomplishments. However, this generational narcissism hypothesis remains controversial, with other studies failing to find consistent increases or attributing apparent changes to measurement artifacts. What does seem clear is that contemporary culture provides ample opportunities for narcissistic expression and may reinforce narcissistic values and behaviors in ways that earlier periods did not. Understanding these multiple pathways to narcissistic development has several important implications. First, it helps us recognize that narcissistic personality disorder is not simply a choice or a moral failing. While individuals with the disorder must still be held accountable for their behavior, particularly abusive behavior toward others, the disorder itself emerges from a complex interplay of factors largely outside anyone's conscious control. Second, it reveals the heterogeneity within the diagnosis. Two people meeting criteria for narcissistic personality disorder might have arrived there through quite different developmental pathways and might require different therapeutic approaches as a result. Third, it suggests potential avenues for prevention and early intervention. While we can't prevent all cases of narcissistic personality disorder, understanding risk factors allows for targeted support. Parents can be educated about the importance of balanced feedback, neither excessively criticizing nor unrealistically inflating their children's qualities. Children experiencing trauma or adversity can receive interventions aimed at promoting healthy emotional development and preventing the personality rigidities that might otherwise emerge. Finally, for survivors of narcissistic abuse, understanding the developmental origins of the disorder can sometimes help with the healing process. It doesn't excuse the abuse, but it provides context. The narcissist's inability to empathize, their need for constant validation, their rage when challenged, these weren't really about you. They emerged from deep, early wounds in the narcissist's own development. Understanding this doesn't make the abuse hurt less, but it can help survivors stop taking the narcissist's behavior personally, stop searching for what they did wrong, and recognize that no amount of love or understanding on their part could have fixed someone whose personality was organized around defenses against vulnerabilities they couldn't consciously access or acknowledge. Section 4, the narcissistic abuse cycle. Now we turn to the painful dynamics of what happens when someone with narcissistic personality disorder forms an intimate relationship. What unfolds is often a remarkably consistent pattern, a cycle that has been described by researchers, clinicians, and survivors with striking similarity across countless relationships. Understanding this cycle, its phases, and its psychological mechanisms is essential both for recognizing narcissistic abuse and for beginning to heal from it. The cycle is typically described in three main phases: idealization, devaluation, and discard. though some models add a fourth phase, hoovering, when the narcissist attempts to draw the target back in. These phases don't necessarily occur once. They often repeat, sometimes many times, creating a dizzying instability that leaves survivors confused, traumatized, and questioning their own perception of reality. Let's walk through each phase, understanding not just what happens, but why. What psychological needs drive the narcissist's behavior, and what effects these dynamics have on their targets. The cycle begins with idealization, often called the love bombing phase in romantic relationships. This is the period when the narcissist seems perfect, when the relationship feels magical, when you feel more special, more understood, more loved than ever before. And that feeling isn't entirely an illusion. The narcissist genuinely feels it too, at least in the moment. They've found what they believe to be the perfect source of narcissistic supply. During idealization, the narcissist showers their target with attention, affection, and admiration. If it's a romantic relationship, this might involve excessive communication, hours-long phone calls or text exchanges, rapid expressions of love, grand romantic gestures, expensive gifts, elaborate dates. The narcissist moves the relationship forward at a dizzying pace. They might talk about marriage or a future together within weeks. They might want to move in together quickly, become sexually involved immediately, or merge their lives in ways that would normally take much longer to develop. The narcissist engages in what's called mirroring. They reflect back to you your own values, interests, preferences, even your mannerisms and speech patterns. If you love hiking, they suddenly love hiking too. If you value loyalty above all else, they present themselves as the most loyal person imaginable. If you've been hurt by past partners' dishonesty, they emphasize their commitment to truth. It can feel like you've finally met your soulmate, someone who understands you completely, who shares your vision of life, who sees you in a way no one else has. This mirroring serves a purpose beyond simple deception. The narcissist needs to create a powerful bond, to establish themselves as irreplaceable in your life, because they need you to serve as a stable source of narcissistic supply. That constant stream of admiration, attention, and validation they require to maintain their fragile self-esteem. They're also gathering information about you, your insecurities, your deepest fears, your greatest longings, your boundaries, what you've tolerated in the past. They're learning how to control you, though this process is often not fully conscious. During the idealization phase, the target feels euphoric. The experience resembles addiction in neurobiological terms. The constant attention, affection, and validation activate the brain's reward circuits powerfully. You may find yourself thinking about the narcissist constantly, feeling a high when you're together, experiencing withdrawal when apart. You may ignore warning signs that part of you recognizes. The relationship is moving too fast. They're pushing for commitment before you truly know each other. They're isolating you from friends or family. They're subtly testing your boundaries. But the idealization feels so good. And after perhaps experiencing loneliness, past relationship disappointments, or a period of low self-esteem, it's intoxicating to feel so desired, so special. The narcissist has identified what you need emotionally and is providing it with an intensity you may never have experienced. It creates a powerful psychological imprint. This person makes me feel the way I've always wanted to feel. However, the idealization phase cannot last. And here's why. You're not actually perfect. No one is. Inevitably, you reveal yourself to be a real, flawed human being with your own needs, moods, limitations, and desires that don't always align with the narcissists. You might have a bad day and be unable to provide the enthusiastic admiration they expect. You might assert a boundary, saying no to something they want. You might succeed at something, drawing attention away from them. You might simply exist as a separate person rather than as a perfect mirror reflecting back their grandiosity. When this happens, the narcissist begins to devalue you. This second phase often starts subtly. The excessive attention tapers off. Responses to your messages come more slowly or not at all. Plans get canceled or forgotten. The narcissist seems distracted, distant, less interested. When you ask if something's wrong, they might deny it, making you feel paranoid or needy for noticing the change. Then the criticism begins. It might start as jokes at your expense, little digs disguised as humor. Your appearance, your intelligence, your career, your family, your friends all become targets. If you react with hurt, they accuse you of being too sensitive, unable to take a joke. They might compare you unfavorably to others, particularly to past partners, establishing a triangulation dynamic where you're always competing for their approval, always falling short. The devaluation phase involves a variety of abusive tactics, which we'll explore in depth shortly. But the overall effect is a systematic erosion of your self-esteem and sense of reality. The person who once saw you as perfect now seems to see you as fundamentally flawed. They might criticize behaviors they once praised. That independence they admired becomes selfish neglect. That ambition they celebrated becomes threatening competition. The way you express emotions becomes manipulative or dramatic. Perhaps most confusingly, periods of devaluation are often interspersed with brief returns to idealization. Just when you're ready to leave, when you've had enough of the criticism and emotional abuse, the narcissist becomes sweet again, reminiscent of the early days, promising to change, explaining their behavior in ways that make you doubt your own perceptions. This intermittent reinforcement, this unpredictable alternation between punishment and reward, is psychologically powerful. It creates what psychologists call a variable ratio schedule of reinforcement, the same mechanism that makes gambling addictive. You never know which version of the narcissist you'll encounter. Will today be a good day when they're affectionate and appreciative, or a bad day when everything you do is wrong? This uncertainty keeps you in a state of hypervigilance, constantly monitoring their mood, trying to figure out what will keep the peace, what will bring back the person you fell in love with. You may find yourself walking on eggshells, editing your behavior, suppressing your needs, sacrificing your boundaries, all in an attempt to avoid triggering their displeasure. During devaluation, the narcissist's need for control becomes increasingly apparent. They may track your movements, monitor your communications, demand to know where you are at all times. They may isolate you from friends and family through direct prohibitions, or through subtler means like sulking when you spend time with others, manufacturing crises that require your constant availability, or poisoning your other relationships through lies and manipulation. The devaluation serves multiple functions for the narcissist. It maintains their sense of superiority by putting you down. It punishes you for failing to be the perfect mirror they need. It keeps you off balance and desperate to please, ensuring a steady supply of attention and validation as you try harder and harder to win back their approval. It also allows them to project their own intolerable feelings onto you, making you carry the shame, inadequacy, and worthlessness they can't consciously acknowledge in themselves. For the target, the devaluation phase is devastating. The person you thought loved you now treats you with contempt. You're confused, hurt, desperate to understand what changed. You may believe that if you can just figure out what you're doing wrong, if you can become the person they need you to be, you can restore the love and admiration of the idealization phase. You may spend enormous energy trying to fix things, to communicate more effectively, to meet their needs better. But here's what's crucial to understand. The problem isn't you. The shift from idealization to devaluation wasn't caused by something you did wrong. It's an inevitable part of the narcissistic relational pattern. The narcissist cannot sustain idealization because real people, with their own needs and their own separate existence, always eventually fail to perfectly mirror the narcissist's grandiose self. The devaluation is baked into the dynamics from the start. It was always going to happen. Eventually, many relationships with narcissists move into the discard phase. This is when the narcissist ends the relationship, either explicitly or through behavior that makes continuation impossible. The discard often comes abruptly, with little warning or explanation. You might be having what seems like a normal conversation one day, and the next day you're blocked on all platforms. Your belongings are out on the street, or they've simply vanished, moving on as if the relationship never mattered. Sometimes the discard is more drawn out. The narcissist might maintain the form of the relationship while emotionally abandoning you, becoming so cold and indifferent that you eventually leave. They might be overtly cruel, creating conditions intolerable to anyone with self-respect, effectively forcing you to end things so they can avoid taking responsibility. The discard typically occurs when the narcissist has found a new source of narcissistic supply. While still in a relationship with you, they've likely been grooming a replacement, someone new who can provide the idealization phase all over again, someone who hasn't yet revealed their imperfect humanity. Or the discard might happen when you've asserted boundaries the narcissist finds intolerable, when you've demanded reciprocity or respect, when you've threatened to expose their abuse, or when you simply no longer serve their needs as effectively as you once did. The discard is often the most traumatizing phase for survivors. The person you loved, who you believed loved you, discards you with what seems like ease, often showing no remorse, no sadness, no acknowledgement of the relationship's significance. They may immediately and publicly display their new relationship, making you feel replaced and worthless. They may badmouth you to others, rewriting history to cast you as the problem, the crazy one, the abusive one. This smear campaign serves to protect their image and to ensure that you won't be believed if you try to tell others what really happened. For many survivors, the discard creates intense psychological distress. You may experience symptoms consistent with grief, trauma, and abandonment. You might have intrusive thoughts about the relationship, replay interactions trying to understand what went wrong, alternate between anger and desperate longing to get them back. The cognitive dissonance is enormous. How do you reconcile the person who seemed to love you so completely during idealization with the person who discarded you so callously? But often, the discard isn't permanent, which brings us to the fourth phase, hoovering. The term comes from the Hoover vacuum cleaner brand and refers to the narcissist's attempts to suck you back into the relationship. Hoovering can happen weeks, months, or even years after the discard. The hoovering might involve direct contact, a late-night text saying they miss you, a heartfelt letter apologizing and promising change, showing up at your workplace or home, sending gifts, or reaching out through mutual friends or family members. The narcissist might claim they've changed, that they've been in therapy, that they've realized how special you were and how badly they treated you. They might love bomb you all over again, recreating the magic of the idealization phase. Or the hoovering might be more indirect, posting on social media in ways clearly designed for you to see, letting mutual friends know they're asking about you, creating situations where you're likely to run into each other. Even negative contact, like starting fights or creating drama, can be a form of hoovering. For the narcissist, negative attention is better than no attention. Why does the narcissist hoover? Several reasons. Their new supply might not be working out, or might be starting to show signs of having their own needs and boundaries. The narcissist might be between sources of supply and need validation. They might be facing consequences for their behavior and need you to rescue them. They might simply enjoy the power of knowing they can still affect you, can still draw you back in, despite how badly they treated you. Many survivors fall for hoovering, particularly the first time. The pain of the discard is so intense, the longing for the idealization phase so powerful, that when the narcissist returns, offering a chance to get that feeling back, it's difficult to resist. You might believe their promises to change. You might minimize or rationalize what happened before. You might blame yourself for the relationship's problems and believe that if you do things differently this time, it will work. But here's what virtually always happens when someone returns to a relationship with a narcissist after hoovering. The cycle repeats. There might be a brief honeymoon period, a mini idealization phase, but it doesn't last as long this time. The devaluation returns, often more quickly and more intensely. The narcissist has learned that you'll take them back, that your boundaries aren't firm, and they may treat you worse as a result. Many survivors report that each cycle is worse than the last. Understanding this cycle is crucial for several reasons. First, it helps survivors recognize that what they experienced wasn't a relationship that simply went bad or two people who were incompatible. It was a patterned, predictable form of abuse. Second, it helps explain the addictive quality of relationships with narcissists. The intermittent reinforcement, the alternation between the highs of idealization and the lows of devaluation creates powerful emotional bonds that are difficult to break. But here's what makes this truly fascinating from a neuroscience perspective. When researchers compare the brain scans and neurochemical patterns of people in narcissistically abusive relationships to those of people with substance addictions, they find striking similarities. The variable ratio schedule of reinforcement, unpredictable rewards after varying amounts of effort, that characterizes gambling addiction operates identically in narcissistic relationships. During idealization, or brief returns to kindness, the brain floods with dopamine and oxytocin. During devaluation, these neurotransmitters drop, creating something akin to withdrawal. Over time, the nervous system becomes conditioned to this pattern, which could explain why many survivors report literal physical withdrawal symptoms after leaving. Anxiety, insomnia, obsessive thoughts about the narcissist, physical cravings for contact, even feeling physically ill. This isn't metaphorical. Based on what neuroscience reveals about addiction and attachment, we can infer that the phrase "addicted to a toxic relationship" may be more literally accurate than most people realize. The same brain circuits involved in drug addiction appear to be activated in trauma-bonded relationships, suggesting that recovery from narcissistic abuse may require similar approaches to addiction recovery: complete abstinence, no contact, support systems, recognition of triggers, and understanding that the craving doesn't mean the relationship was good or that you should return to it. The narcissistic abuse cycle creates what researchers call trauma bonding, particularly powerful attachment bonds that form in abusive relationships. These bonds develop through the combination of intermittent reinforcement, power imbalances, periods of intense connection alternating with abuse, and the victim's isolation and dependence on the abuser. Trauma bonds explain why leaving feels so difficult, why contact with the narcissist, even negative contact, can feel compelling, and why survivors often return multiple times before achieving lasting separation. Breaking the cycle requires understanding it, recognizing that it will repeat, and making the decision that you deserve better than this pattern. It requires accepting that the person you fell in love with during the idealization phase wasn't real, that it was a performance, a reflection of what the narcissist thought you wanted to see. The real relationship is the whole cycle: the idealization and the devaluation and the discard, and that's not acceptable, not healthy, not loving. For those who have experienced this cycle, know that your confusion, your pain, your difficulty leaving, these are normal responses to an abnormal situation. The cycle is designed to trap you, to keep you hoping and trying and believing that if you can just get it right, the idealization will return and stay. But it won't. The cycle will continue until you remove yourself from it entirely. And when you do, when you break free, healing can finally begin. Section 5. The language of manipulation. Within the narcissistic abuse cycle operates a sophisticated array of manipulation tactics, psychological strategies the narcissist employs to maintain control, extract narcissistic supply, and prevent their target from recognizing the abuse or leaving the relationship. While narcissists use many forms of manipulation, we're going to focus particularly on gaslighting, one of the most pernicious and psychologically damaging tactics, before examining other common strategies. Gaslighting is a form of psychological manipulation where the abuser makes the victim question their own perception, memory, judgment, and sanity. The term comes from a 1944 film called Gaslight, in which a husband systematically manipulates his wife into believing she's losing her mind by dimming the gaslights in their home and insisting she's imagining the changes. Though the term is relatively new, the phenomenon it describes is ancient. The deliberate distortion of reality to gain power over another person. What makes gaslighting so effective and so damaging is that it attacks the foundation of your ability to navigate reality, your trust in your own perceptions and memories. When someone consistently denies your experience, contradicts your memories, or tells you that what you clearly saw or heard didn't happen, you begin to doubt yourself. And when you doubt yourself, when you can't trust your own mind, you become dependent on the gaslighter to define reality for you. This dependence is exactly what the gaslighter seeks. Gaslighting in narcissistic relationships typically begins subtly. The narcissist might deny saying something you clearly remember them saying. When you bring up a hurtful comment they made yesterday, they look at you with confusion and say, "I never said that. You're making things up." Or they claim you misunderstood, that you're too sensitive, that it was just a joke. They might accuse you of starting arguments over nothing, making you feel like you're overreacting to invisible slights. As gaslighting intensifies, the distortions become more elaborate. The narcissist might rewrite entire conversations or events. They'll claim that you said things you never said, or that events unfolded in ways completely different from what you remember. If you have evidence, like a text message proving what was said, they'll find ways to explain it away, to make you doubt even documented reality. They might say the message doesn't mean what it clearly means, or they'll shift the focus to some tiny irrelevant detail, or they'll become so angry at being accused that you back down. One of the most crazy-making aspects of gaslighting is the narcissist's ability to reverse victim and offender. They do something hurtful. You express your pain about it, and suddenly you're the problem. You're too sensitive, too dramatic, too emotional. You're attacking them for no reason. They're the victim of your unreasonable accusations. Before you know what's happened, you're apologizing to them for being hurt by their behavior. Gaslighting employs several specific techniques. Countering involves the abuser questioning your memories and perception even when you're certain of them. They'll say things like, "That's not how it happened. You always get things wrong," or "Your memory is terrible." Over time, this constant contradiction makes you doubt your own recollections. Withholding is when the abuser refuses to engage with your concerns, pretending not to understand, or refusing to listen. They might say, "I don't want to hear this again. I don't know what you're talking about," or simply ignore you when you try to discuss the relationship. This tactic invalidates your concerns and trains you to stop bringing things up. Diverting involves changing the subject or questioning your thought process rather than addressing the content of what you're saying. If you bring up something hurtful they did, they might respond, "Why are you always dwelling on the past?" Or, "Why do you always focus on negative things?" This shifts focus from their behavior to what they frame as your problem. Trivializing is making your concerns seem unimportant or ridiculous. You're making a big deal out of nothing. Other people don't have a problem with this. You're overreacting as usual. This tactic makes you feel foolish for having feelings or concerns. Denial is straightforward lying about things that happened. Even when confronted with evidence, the gaslighter might flat out deny reality. This is particularly effective because most people can't fathom that someone would lie so boldly, so they begin to question their own certainty. Projection is when the gaslighter attributes their own unacceptable thoughts, feelings, or behaviors to you. If they're being unfaithful, they accuse you of cheating. If they're angry and hostile, they accuse you of being hostile. If they're lying, they accuse you of being dishonest. This reversal is deeply confusing and makes you defensive, focused on proving you're not doing what they claim rather than addressing their actual behavior. The effects of prolonged gaslighting are profound. Survivors often describe feeling like they're going crazy, like they can't trust their own mind. They become uncertain about even basic perceptions and memories. They constantly second-guess themselves, apologize excessively, and feel confused about what's real. They may develop anxiety, depression, or symptoms consistent with complex post-traumatic stress disorder, which we'll explore in the next section. Gaslighting makes you dependent on the gaslighter's version of reality. Since you can't trust your own perceptions, you have to rely on theirs. This dependence keeps you in the relationship even when part of you knows something is deeply wrong. You think, I must be overreacting. They say I'm too sensitive, and maybe I am. Maybe things aren't as bad as they seem to me. But gaslighting isn't the only manipulation tactic narcissists employ. Triangulation is another common strategy. This involves bringing a third party into the relationship dynamic to create jealousy, insecurity, or competition. The narcissist might constantly reference an ex-partner, comparing you unfavorably or reminiscing about how special that relationship was. They might flirt with others in front of you, then accuse you of being jealous or controlling when you object. They might share details of your private life with family members or friends, then reference these conversations to you, saying, "Everyone agrees you're being unreasonable." Triangulation serves multiple purposes. It keeps you insecure and competing for the narcissist's approval. It provides the narcissist with multiple sources of narcissistic supply. It isolates you by damaging your other relationships and making you focus all your energy on the narcissist. And it allows the narcissist to play people against each other, maintaining control while avoiding accountability. The silent treatment is another devastating tactic. When you've somehow displeased the narcissist, perhaps by asserting a boundary or failing to provide sufficient admiration, they withdraw all communication. They might ignore your messages, refuse to speak to you, or act as if you don't exist. The silent treatment is a form of emotional abandonment, triggering primitive fears and making you desperate to restore connection. Usually you end up apologizing or capitulating to whatever the narcissist wants just to end the painful rejection. Love bombing, which we discussed in the idealization phase, continues throughout the relationship as a manipulation tactic. The narcissist uses brief periods of excessive affection and attention to keep you hoping that the good person will return and stay. After a period of devaluation, they suddenly become attentive and affectionate again, making grand gestures or promises, recreating that initial magical feeling. This intermittent reinforcement is extraordinarily effective at maintaining your attachment. Future faking involves making elaborate promises about a shared future that the narcissist has no intention of fulfilling. They talk about marriage, children, moving to your dream location, starting a business together, taking that special trip. These promises keep you invested in the relationship, keep you believing that the difficulties now will be worth it for that wonderful future. But that future never comes. There's always some reason to delay, some condition you haven't met, some external obstacle. The future remains perpetually in the future. Blame shifting ensures that nothing is ever the narcissist's fault. When their behavior causes problems, they make it your fault. You made them angry. You provoked their reaction. You're too demanding or too needy or too independent or too emotional. They take no responsibility for their choices or actions. Instead, making you responsible not just for your own behavior, but for theirs as well. Lying is pervasive in narcissistic relationships, though it may not always be obvious. The narcissist lies both explicitly and by omission. They fabricate stories, exaggerate their accomplishments, invent reasons for their behavior. Even when caught in lies, they often double down, becoming aggressive or creating elaborate explanations rather than admitting the truth. The constant lying creates an atmosphere of unreality where you never quite know what's true. Isolation is a gradual process whereby the narcissist separates you from your support system. They might do this overtly, prohibiting contact with certain people, or becoming angry when you spend time with others. More often, it's subtle. They sulk when you have plans with friends. They create crises that require you to cancel. They badmouth your family and friends, sowing seeds of doubt about those relationships. They monopolize your time and energy so completely that you have none left for others. Before you realize it, you've become isolated, dependent primarily on the narcissist for social connection and validation. Understanding these manipulation tactics serves several purposes. For those currently in relationships with narcissists, recognizing the tactics can be the first step towards seeing the abuse for what it is. These aren't normal relationship difficulties. These are calculated strategies designed to control and confuse you. For those recovering from narcissistic relationships, understanding manipulation tactics helps answer the question, was it really abuse? Yes, these patterns constitute psychological and emotional abuse, even in the absence of physical violence. It's important to note that not all people who use these tactics have narcissistic personality disorder. Gaslighting, triangulation, and other manipulation strategies can be employed by people with various personality structures or mental health conditions, or even by people without any diagnosable condition who've learned these behaviors in their families of origin. However, in the context of someone with significant narcissistic pathology, these tactics are particularly persistent, pervasive, and resistant to change. What makes these manipulations especially effective is that they exploit normal human psychology. We're hardwired to trust those we love, to want to think the best of our partners, to explain away contradictions, to hold on to hope that things will improve. The narcissist takes advantage of these normal tendencies, using them to maintain control and extract supply. For survivors working to heal, understanding that you were deliberately manipulated can be both validating and painful. It validates your sense that something was wrong, that what you experienced was real abuse, not just communication problems or incompatibility. But it can be painful to recognize that someone you loved was using calculated tactics to control you, that the relationship you thought you had was largely an illusion. One crucial thing to remember: being manipulated doesn't mean you were weak or foolish. These tactics work on smart, capable, strong people. They work because they're sophisticated forms of psychological abuse, refined over time, targeting normal human vulnerabilities. Your susceptibility to manipulation doesn't reflect poorly on you. What matters is recognizing it, understanding it, and eventually freeing yourself from it. Section 6. The psychological aftermath. The impact of narcissistic abuse extends far beyond the end of the relationship. Survivors often carry psychological wounds that persist for months or years, manifesting in a constellation of symptoms that clinicians and researchers have come to recognize as remarkably consistent across cases. While there's debate about whether narcissistic abuse constitutes a discrete syndrome, there's no question that it causes significant psychological trauma, frequently meeting criteria for post-traumatic stress disorder, or more commonly, complex post-traumatic stress disorder. Let's start by understanding the difference between PTSD and CPTSD, and why narcissistic abuse typically causes the latter. Post-traumatic stress disorder, as defined in the DSM-5, develops following exposure to actual or threatened death, serious injury, or sexual violence. The trauma is typically a discrete event or series of events: a car accident, combat exposure, a natural disaster, an assault. The person develops symptoms in 4 clusters: intrusive memories or flashbacks of the traumatic event, avoidance of reminders of the trauma, negative alterations in cognitions and mood, and alterations in arousal and reactivity like hypervigilance or exaggerated startle response. Complex post-traumatic stress disorder, recognized in the ICD-11, though not yet formally in the DSM, develops following prolonged and repeated trauma from which escape is difficult or impossible. The canonical examples are childhood abuse, domestic violence, trafficking, torture, or captivity. CPTSD includes all the symptoms of regular PTSD, but adds 3 additional clusters of symptoms: affective dysregulation, negative self-concept, and disturbances in relationships. Narcissistic abuse, particularly in intimate relationships, but also in parent-child relationships, typically causes CPTSD rather than simple PTSD because it's prolonged, repeated, and involves a person from whom you cannot easily escape or to whom you're deeply attached. The trauma isn't a single event, but an ongoing pattern of psychological abuse that gradually erodes your sense of self, your emotional stability, and your ability to trust. Let's walk through the symptoms survivors commonly experience, understanding not just what they are, but why they develop in response to narcissistic abuse. Intrusive memories and flashbacks are common. Survivors report suddenly being flooded with memories of particularly painful interactions with the narcissist, the look of contempt on their face, the words they said during a particularly cruel devaluation, the moment you realized they were lying. These memories can be triggered by external reminders, like seeing someone who resembles the narcissist or hearing a song that was significant in the relationship, or they can arise seemingly out of nowhere. Intrusive thoughts that hijack your attention and emotional state. Nightmares are frequent. You might dream about the narcissist, replaying conflicts or searching for them, trying to fix the relationship. Or the dreams might be more symbolic, being chased, trapped, unable to speak or be heard, losing something precious. These dreams often wake you with your heart pounding, sometimes multiple times a night, leaving you exhausted and depleted. Hypervigilance becomes a default state. Even after the relationship ends, you remain on high alert, scanning for danger, monitoring the emotional atmosphere, trying to predict and prevent the next attack. This made sense during the relationship, when the narcissist's mood could shift unpredictably, and you needed to be vigilant to protect yourself. But the nervous system doesn't easily turn off this state of heightened arousal. You may find yourself jumping at sudden sounds, feeling panicked in situations that resemble arguments with the narcissist, or being unable to relax even in objectively safe situations. Avoidance is another common response. You might avoid places that remind you of the narcissist, situations that trigger memories, or even emotions that feel too overwhelming to process. Some survivors throw themselves into work or other activities, keeping themselves constantly busy to avoid having to think about what happened. Others withdraw socially, isolating themselves from relationships that might become painful, preferring the safety of solitude. Emotional dysregulation becomes pronounced. During the relationship, you likely learn to suppress your authentic feelings, to manage the narcissist's emotions at the expense of your own, to exist in a state of chronic fear and confusion. After the relationship, emotions can feel overwhelming and uncontrollable. You might experience sudden rage, bursts of tears seemingly out of nowhere, mood swings that feel irrational, or emotional numbness, where you feel detached from feelings altogether. The ability to regulate emotions, to feel them without being overwhelmed by them, has been damaged by the chronic stress and emotional abuse of the narcissistic relationship. The negative self-concept that characterizes CPTSD is particularly pronounced for narcissistic abuse survivors. The narcissist spent months or years systematically devaluing you, criticizing you, blaming you for their behavior, making you responsible for their feelings and the relationship's problems. Even after leaving, you carry internalized versions of their voice, their criticisms, their contempt. You may feel fundamentally flawed, unlovable, worthless. You may believe you deserved the abuse, or that you're too damaged for anyone to want you. The shame survivors carry is often pervasive and debilitating. Self-doubt becomes automatic. Years of gaslighting have taught you not to trust your own perceptions, memories, or judgment. You second-guess even simple decisions. You constantly question whether you're remembering things correctly, whether your feelings are valid, whether you're overreacting, or being too sensitive. This erosion of confidence in your own mind is one of the most insidious effects of narcissistic abuse. Disturbances in relationships persist long after the narcissistic relationship ends. You may struggle to trust new partners, constantly watching for signs of narcissistic behavior, unable to relax into connection. You might oscillate between being overly accommodating, falling back into people-pleasing patterns learned in the narcissistic relationship, and being defensively rigid, setting walls so high that genuine intimacy becomes impossible. You may find yourself attracted to similar personality types, unconsciously seeking to replay, and perhaps this time resolve the original trauma. Or you may avoid relationships altogether, deciding that the risk of being hurt again is too great. Some survivors develop what's sometimes called narcissistic victim syndrome or narcissistic abuse syndrome, terms that capture the specific constellation of symptoms and experiences common to those who've been in relationships with narcissists. These aren't formal diagnostic categories, but they help validate survivors' experiences and recognize that narcissistic abuse has specific, predictable effects. Common features of narcissistic victim syndrome include Learned helplessness, where you've tried so many times to improve the relationship, to communicate more effectively, to meet the narcissist's needs, and failed so consistently that you've developed a belief that your actions don't matter, that you're powerless to affect your circumstances. This learned helplessness can persist after the relationship, making it difficult to take action to improve your life. Trauma bonding, which we discussed earlier, creates powerful feelings of attachment to the abuser that persist even after recognizing the abuse. You may find yourself longing for the narcissist despite knowing intellectually that the relationship was harmful, missing them intensely, fantasizing about reconciliation. These feelings can be confusing and shameful, but they're normal responses to intermittent reinforcement in the neurobiological bonding that occurred during periods of idealization. Cognitive dissonance, that uncomfortable psychological state of holding contradictory beliefs, is intense for survivors. You know the narcissist abused you, but you remember the idealization phase when they seemed perfect. You know they lack empathy, but you witnessed moments that seemed caring. You know leaving was necessary, but you feel guilty about it. Resolving this cognitive dissonance, integrating the contradictory experiences into a coherent understanding of what the relationship actually was, is a major part of healing. Many survivors experience what might be called moral injury, a deep sense that something precious has been violated, that your trust and love were exploited, that the fundamental understanding of how relationships should work has been shattered. You believed that if you loved someone genuinely, treated them well, communicated openly, the relationship would work. The narcissistic relationship proved that belief wrong in the most painful way possible. This loss of innocence, this recognition that love isn't always enough, that some people will exploit rather than reciprocate genuine care, can feel shattering. Physical health consequences are also common. The chronic stress of living with a narcissist takes a toll on the body. Survivors often report various stress-related conditions: chronic pain, gastrointestinal problems, headaches, autoimmune conditions, cardiovascular issues. The hypervigilance and emotional dysregulation of CPTSD involve chronic activation of the stress response system, flooding the body with cortisol and adrenaline, suppressing immune function and creating inflammation. Over time, this chronic stress damages physical health. Sleep disturbances are nearly universal. Nightmares disturb your sleep. Hypervigilance makes it difficult to fall asleep or stay asleep. Anxiety produces racing thoughts at night. Many survivors develop insomnia, going months or even years without truly restful sleep, which further impairs emotional regulation, cognitive function, and physical health. Some survivors develop dissociative symptoms. Dissociation is a disconnection from present experience, ranging from mild depersonalization, where you feel detached from your body or emotions, to more severe episodes of feeling completely disconnected from reality or losing time. Dissociation is a protective mechanism the mind uses when emotions or experiences become overwhelming. During the narcissistic relationship, dissociation may have been a survival strategy, allowing you to endure the abuse by mentally checking out. After the relationship, dissociation may continue, activated by triggers that remind you of the trauma or simply as a default response to stress. It's crucial to understand that all these symptoms, painful and disruptive as they are, represent normal responses to abnormal circumstances. You're not crazy. You're not weak. Your nervous system and psyche are doing exactly what they're designed to do when exposed to prolonged psychological trauma, trying to protect you, trying to prevent the trauma from happening again, trying to process and make sense of overwhelming experiences. The challenge is that these protective responses, adaptive during the trauma, become maladaptive afterward. The hypervigilance that kept you safer in the narcissistic relationship now exhausts you and prevents relaxation in safe situations. The emotional suppression that helped you survive now prevents you from accessing and processing your feelings. The self-doubt that helped you avoid the narcissist's rage now prevents you from trusting your own judgment and moving forward with confidence. Healing from narcissistic abuse involves recognizing these symptoms as trauma responses rather than personal failings, understanding their origins, and gradually learning new responses that serve you better in your post-abuse life. It's a process that typically requires professional support, which we'll discuss in a later section. But understanding the nature and extent of the psychological aftermath is the necessary first step. For those currently experiencing these symptoms, please know they will not last forever. With appropriate support and intervention, the intensity of trauma symptoms decreases. The flashbacks become less frequent. The hypervigilance gradually relaxes. The capacity for trust and connection can be rebuilt. The self-doubt and shame can be challenged and transformed. Recovery is possible, though it requires time, patience, and often professional help. You can heal from this, even when it doesn't feel like it. Section 7. Why leaving is so difficult. One of the most misunderstood aspects of narcissistic abuse is why victims struggle so profoundly to leave. From the outside, the relationship may look obviously toxic. Friends and family members can see the abuse clearly, wonder why their loved one stays, sometimes become frustrated or judgmental. Why don't they just leave? Why do they keep going back? Surely they must know this isn't healthy. But those questions fundamentally misunderstand the psychological dynamics at play in narcissistic relationships. Leaving isn't a simple matter of recognizing abuse and walking away. Numerous powerful psychological, emotional, practical, and sometimes physical factors make leaving extraordinarily difficult. Let's start with cognitive dissonance, that psychological discomfort that arises from holding contradictory beliefs. In a narcissistic relationship, you hold multiple contradictory beliefs simultaneously. You believe your partner loves you, evidenced by the idealization phase, by moments of connection, by their declarations of love. You also believe your partner is cruel, evidenced by the devaluation, the manipulation, the contempt. You believe the relationship can be saved if you just try harder, communicate better, meet their needs more effectively. You also believe, perhaps more quietly, that nothing you do makes a lasting difference. These contradictory beliefs create intense psychological discomfort. The mind seeks to resolve this dissonance, and there are several ways to do so. One option is to leave the relationship, which resolves the contradiction by removing yourself from the source of conflicting information. But that option is extraordinarily painful, involving grief, loss, uncertainty, and often significant practical disruption. A psychologically easier solution is to adjust your beliefs to reduce the contradiction. You might minimize the abuse. It wasn't that bad. You're being too sensitive. All relationships have problems. You might rationalize it. They had a difficult childhood, they're stressed at work. They don't really mean it. You might blame yourself. If you were better, more understanding, less needy, they wouldn't treat you this way. All these cognitive adjustments reduce dissonance by making the abuse your fault or less significant, allowing you to maintain the belief that the relationship is fundamentally good and worth preserving. Trauma bonding is perhaps the most powerful factor keeping victims in narcissistic relationships. We've mentioned trauma bonding before, but let's explore it more deeply. Trauma bonds are powerful emotional attachments that develop in abusive relationships, characterized by intermittent reinforcement, power imbalances, and the presence of both abuse and positive experiences. The intermittent reinforcement, that unpredictable alternation between punishment and reward, is psychologically powerful in ways that consistent kindness or consistent cruelty never could be. If someone is always kind to you, you appreciate them, but there's no urgency to their presence. If someone is consistently cruel, you leave. But when someone alternates between extraordinary kindness and terrible cruelty unpredictably, something neurologically profound happens. Your brain's reward system becomes hijacked. During good periods, during moments when the narcissist is affectionate, or when briefly returning to idealization behaviors, your brain floods with dopamine and oxytocin. You feel relief, hope, love, connection. But this feeling is intensified precisely because it follows pain. The contrast between the low of abuse and the high of reconnection makes the reconnection feel more powerful than it would in a consistently healthy relationship. Because you never know when the reward will come, you keep trying, hoping each attempt will be the one that brings back the person you fell in love with. This is the same mechanism that makes gambling addictive. If a slot machine paid out every time, it wouldn't be compelling. If it never paid out, you'd stop playing. But when it pays out unpredictably, occasionally, your brain becomes fixated on the possibility of reward, and you keep playing despite mounting losses. In a narcissistic relationship, you keep investing emotional energy, keep trying to be better, keep hoping this time will be different, because you've experienced those moments of connection and you believe they're possible again. If you can just figure out the right combination of behaviors, the fact that your efforts so rarely work doesn't diminish hope. Paradoxically, the scarcity of positive responses makes them more precious when they occur. Trauma bonds also create powerful physiological dependency. The stress and relief cycle in narcissistic relationships creates neurochemical patterns similar to addiction. The stress produces cortisol and adrenaline. When relief comes, when the narcissist is kind again, after a period of devaluation, your body floods with endorphins and dopamine. Over time, your nervous system becomes conditioned to this pattern. Contact with the narcissist, even negative contact, produces familiar neurochemical responses that, paradoxically, your body begins to crave. This explains why many survivors experience withdrawal symptoms after leaving, quite literally feeling physically sick, experiencing intense anxiety, having overwhelming urges to contact the narcissist despite knowing it's harmful. Your nervous system is going through withdrawal from a biochemical pattern it became dependent on. The hope that the real person will return is another factor keeping victims trapped. During idealization, the narcissist presented a version of themselves that seemed authentic, loving, wonderful. That person felt real. When devaluation began, it seemed aberrant, like something was temporarily wrong that could be fixed. You keep believing that the idealization version is the authentic self, and the devaluation version is a response to stress, past trauma, your failures, or other temporary factors. But here's the difficult truth. Neither version is more real than the other. Both are expressions of the narcissistic personality structure. The idealization is a performance designed to secure narcissistic supply. The devaluation is what emerges when you fail to perfectly mirror the narcissist's grandiose self. There's no hidden healthy person underneath waiting to emerge if only conditions were right. The whole cycle is the reality of the relationship. Accepting this is extraordinarily painful. It means acknowledging that the person you fell in love with was never fully real, that the relationship you thought you had was largely an illusion. Many survivors resist this recognition for months or years, holding on to hope that the good person will return, that this time the reconciliation will last, that they can somehow earn back the treatment they received during idealization. Isolation plays a crucial role in trapping victims. Narcissists typically isolate their targets from support systems, and this isolation makes leaving exponentially harder. When you have no one to validate your perceptions, to reassure you that you're not crazy, to offer emotional support or practical help, the idea of leaving feels overwhelming. Moreover, if you do express concerns about the relationship to whatever contacts remain, the narcissist has often already conducted a smear campaign, poisoning your relationships with family and friends by portraying you as unstable, problematic, or abusive. When you try to explain what's happening, others may have already internalized the narcissist's narrative, making them skeptical of your account or unsupportive of your desire to leave. Fear of the narcissist's reaction is very real. While not all narcissists are physically violent, many are, and narcissistic rage can be frightening even when it doesn't involve physical aggression. The intensity of the narcissist's anger when they feel abandoned or challenged can be terrifying. Survivors often stay because they're afraid of what the narcissist will do if they try to leave, destroying property, spreading lies more aggressively, harassing them at work, fighting for custody of children, or becoming physically violent. These fears are often well-founded. The period of leaving and immediately after leaving are typically the most dangerous times in abusive relationships. The narcissist is losing control, losing their source of narcissistic supply, experiencing profound narcissistic injury. Their reaction can be extreme and unpredictable. Many survivors calculate, consciously or unconsciously, that staying is safer than the risk of leaving. Practical entrapment contributes significantly. Many victims of narcissistic abuse are financially dependent on the narcissist, who may control all finances, prevent them from working, or sabotage their employment. Leaving might mean facing homelessness, poverty, or inability to support children. The practical barriers can feel insurmountable. Shared children create another powerful form of entrapment. Leaving means either sharing custody, which requires ongoing contact with the narcissist and exposes children to their behavior without your protection, or fighting for sole custody, which is expensive, emotionally draining, and uncertain. Many victims, particularly mothers, stay in narcissistic relationships to protect their children from the narcissist's unsupervised influence, calculating that being present provides some buffer. Societal and cultural factors also contribute. In many cultures, divorce or leaving a long-term relationship carries significant stigma. Religious communities may discourage or forbid divorce. Family expectations may pressure staying together. The narcissist often leverages these cultural factors, using religious teachings or cultural values to argue that the victim should forgive, try harder, honor their commitment. There's also the sunk cost fallacy, the tendency to continue investing in something because of how much has already been invested. You've given years to this relationship. You've sacrificed so much, endured so much. Leaving feels like admitting that all that investment was wasted. Many victims stay because starting over feels impossible because they've already lost so much that walking away with nothing feels unbearable. Self-blame makes leaving seem unnecessary. If you believe the problems are your fault, that you're too sensitive, too demanding, not understanding enough, then leaving doesn't address the problem. Changing yourself does. The narcissist has usually spent considerable effort convincing you that you're the problem, that your reactions are disproportionate, that you're impossible to please. If you've internalized these messages, you don't see leaving as escape from abuse, but as running away from legitimate relationship issues that you're causing. Low self-esteem, carefully cultivated by months or years of devaluation, makes victims believe they don't deserve better or couldn't attract anyone better. The narcissist may have explicitly told you that no one else would want you, that you're lucky they put up with you, that you'd be alone forever if you left. Even without explicit statements, the constant criticism and contempt erode self-worth to the point where leaving feels like giving up the only relationship you could possibly have. Many survivors also struggle with a sense of responsibility for the narcissist. You've seen their vulnerability, their pain, their insecurity beneath the grandiosity. You know about their difficult childhood or past traumas. You feel that leaving would destroy them, that they need you, that abandoning them would be cruel. This sense of responsibility is often cultivated intentionally by vulnerable narcissists who present themselves as fragile and make you feel you're the only thing keeping them stable. The complexity of emotions involved makes leaving harder. You don't just feel one thing about the narcissist. You feel a tangled web of contradictory emotions. Love, hate, fear, hope, disgust, longing, all existing simultaneously. You can be desperate to leave and desperate to stay in the same moment. You can logically know you should go while emotionally feeling unable to. These contradictory feelings don't represent confusion or weakness. They're normal responses to a complex, traumatic situation. Many survivors also worry about the narcissist's flying monkeys, people enlisted to harass, monitor, or manipulate the victim on the narcissist's behalf. These might be the narcissist's family members, mutual friends, or even the victim's own family members who've been convinced by the narcissist's lies. The thought of facing an entire network of people telling you you're wrong, you're overreacting, you should give the narcissist another chance can feel overwhelming. Understanding why leaving is so difficult helps us approach survivors with compassion rather than judgment. The question isn't, why don't you just leave? But rather, given all these powerful forces keeping you trapped, how can you possibly find a way out? And the answer is, slowly, carefully, with support, with planning, with an understanding that leaving is a process, not a single decision. For those struggling to leave, know that your difficulty doesn't mean you're weak. It means you're human, responding, normally to a carefully constructed trap. Leaving a narcissistic relationship is genuinely one of the hardest things a person can do. Every factor we've discussed is real, and overcoming all of them simultaneously requires enormous courage and strength. The fact that you're considering leaving, thinking about it, reading information like this, these are steps forward, even when you're not ready to leave yet. And for those who've left and returned, or left multiple times before finally staying gone, that's normal too. Research on domestic violence suggests that victims leave an average of 7 times before leaving permanently. Each departure, even when it doesn't stick, is practice. Each time you leave, you prove to yourself that leaving is possible, that you can survive without them, that the world doesn't end when you're apart. Each return teaches you more about the pattern, helps you prepare better for the next attempt, brings you closer to the final departure. Section 8. The path to recovery. Healing from narcissistic abuse is possible, but it's a journey that requires time, patience, and usually professional support. There's no quick fix, no simple formula that works for everyone. Recovery is individual, non-linear, sometimes frustratingly slow. But countless survivors have walked this path before and emerged on the other side, reclaiming their sense of self, rebuilding their capacity for trust, and moving forward into healthier relationships and richer lives. The first step in recovery is often the hardest. Recognizing and accepting that what you experienced was abuse. This recognition can take months or even years after leaving the relationship. The gaslighting, the blame shifting, the internalized belief that you were the problem, all these factors delay recognition. Many survivors spend significant time still defending the narcissist, minimizing the abuse, or taking responsibility for relationship failures that weren't actually their fault. Accepting that it was abuse requires grieving multiple losses simultaneously. You grieve the relationship you thought you had during idealization. You grieve the person you believed the narcissist to be. You grieve the time you invested, the opportunities you missed while trapped in the relationship, perhaps even the person you were before the abuse changed you. You grieve your innocence, your previous trust that people are generally good and relationships generally safe. All these losses are real and deserve mourning. Education about narcissistic personality disorder and narcissistic abuse can be incredibly validating. Reading descriptions of the abuse cycle and recognizing your own experience, learning about manipulation tactics and realizing that's exactly what they did, understanding trauma bonding, and finally comprehending why leaving was so hard. All of this helps you make sense of what felt incomprehensibly chaotic. Education doesn't erase the pain, but it provides a framework for understanding it, which is itself healing. However, there's a caution here. Spending too much time researching narcissism can become a form of avoidance or rumination. Education is important initially, But at some point, continuing to read about narcissism keeps you mentally connected to the abuse rather than moving forward into healing. The balance is finding enough information to understand what happened and validate your experience, then gradually shifting focus toward your own healing rather than analyzing the narcissist. Going no contact, meaning completely cutting off all communication with the narcissist, is generally considered essential for healing. Maintaining any contact makes recovery significantly harder. Every interaction, even seemingly neutral ones, re-triggered trauma responses, offers opportunities for manipulation and prevents the trauma bond from breaking. The narcissist will likely attempt to hoover, to draw you back in, and maintaining contact makes resisting these attempts much more difficult. No contact means blocking the narcissist on all platforms: phone, email, social media, messaging apps. It means not checking their social media, not asking mutual friends about them, not driving by their house or showing up at places they frequent. It means treating any attempts at contact as danger signals and not responding, no matter how compelling the message might seem. For many survivors, especially those sharing children with the narcissist, complete no contact isn't possible. In these cases, gray rock technique can be helpful. Gray rock means making yourself as uninteresting and unresponsive as a gray rock. Boring, giving minimal information, showing no emotional reaction. Keeping all communications strictly focused on necessary logistics. The goal is to be so dull that the narcissist loses interest in trying to engage you. Gray rock in practice means responding to messages about child custody exchanges with brief, factual information only, ignoring attempts to provoke emotional responses, not engaging with insults or manipulation, and keeping all communication in writing to maintain documentation. It's exhausting at first, requiring constant vigilance not to get drawn into the narcissist's attempts to create drama. But it becomes easier with practice. Therapy is one of the most valuable resources for recovery, though finding the right therapist is crucial. You need someone who understands narcissistic abuse and trauma, not someone who will suggest couples counseling or encourage you to understand the narcissist's perspective more deeply. Look for therapists with training in trauma-focused approaches, experience with domestic violence, or specific knowledge of narcissistic abuse. Several therapeutic modalities have proven particularly helpful for narcissistic abuse survivors. Eye movement, desensitization, and reprocessing (EMDR) was originally developed for PTSD and works remarkably well for the trauma symptoms survivors experience. EMDR uses bilateral stimulation, typically eye movements, to help the brain reprocess traumatic memories, reducing their emotional charge and allowing integration of the experience. Cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT, helps identify and challenge the distorted thought patterns that developed during the abusive relationship, the negative beliefs about yourself, the self-blame, the minimization of abuse. CBT provides tools for recognizing these patterns and developing healthier ways of thinking. Dialectical behavior therapy, DBT, originally developed for borderline personality disorder, teaches skills in emotion regulation, distress tolerance, interpersonal effectiveness, and mindfulness. These skills are enormously helpful for managing the emotional dysregulation that characterizes CPTSD from narcissistic abuse. Internal family systems therapy, IFS, helps you work with the different parts of yourself that developed in response to the trauma. The part that wants to go back, the part that's angry, the part that feels ashamed, the part that's trying to protect you. IFS helps these parts communicate and work together rather than being in conflict, facilitating integration and healing. Somatic experiencing and other body-based therapies recognize that trauma is stored not just in the mind, but in the body. The chronic hyperarousal of CPTSD lives in your nervous system, in your muscles, in the way you breathe and move. Somatic approaches help release this stored trauma through attention to bodily sensations, movement, and working directly with the nervous system's activation patterns. Group therapy or support groups can be particularly valuable. Connecting with others who've experienced narcissistic abuse reduces the isolation that's such a painful part of the aftermath. Hearing other people's stories and recognizing the patterns you experienced validates that what happened to you was real and wasn't your fault. Sharing your own story and receiving empathy and understanding from others who truly comprehend begins to repair the relational wounds the abuse created. Self-compassion is crucial, but often difficult for survivors. You've likely been your own harshest critic, internalized the narcissist's devaluing voice, blamed yourself for staying, for not recognizing the abuse sooner, for all the ways you tried to make the relationship work. Learning to treat yourself with the kindness and understanding you'd offer a dear friend is a gradual process, but essential for healing. Self-compassion practices might include speaking to yourself kindly when you notice self-criticism, recognizing that your responses to the abuse were adaptive given the circumstances, accepting that healing takes time and isn't linear, and treating yourself with patience during difficult moments rather than adding self-judgment to the pain you're already experiencing. Rebuilding your identity is a major part of recovery. During the narcissistic relationship, you likely lost touch with yourself, your preferences, your opinions, your authentic feelings and desires. The narcissist's needs took precedence, and you adapted yourself to their expectations, trying to become whoever you needed to be to avoid devaluation. Now you face the task of rediscovering, or perhaps discovering for the first time, who you actually are. This rediscovery might involve experimenting with activities you enjoyed before the relationship, or exploring new interests. It means learning to listen to your own preferences rather than automatically deferring to others. It means noticing what you feel rather than what you think you should feel. It's reconnecting with old friends the narcissist pushed away, pursuing career goals that were sidelined during the relationship, or simply giving yourself permission to rest and do nothing without feeling guilty. Establishing healthy boundaries becomes essential. During the narcissistic relationship, your boundaries were repeatedly violated, and you may have learned to suppress boundary setting to avoid conflict. Now you need to rebuild this skill. Boundaries aren't walls to keep everyone out. They're guidelines that preserve your well-being while allowing connection with others. Learning to set boundaries involves identifying what feels okay and what doesn't, communicating your limits clearly and calmly, following through with consequences when boundaries are violated, and releasing guilt about having needs and preferences. It also means recognizing that people who respond to reasonable boundaries with anger or manipulation aren't safe people to have in your life. Working through triggers is an ongoing process. Certain situations, words, tones of voice, or dynamics will trigger trauma responses, throwing you back into the fear and pain of the abusive relationship. Initially, these triggers might seem to be everywhere, making the world feel unsafe. With time and therapeutic work, triggers become less frequent and less intense, though some may persist for years. When triggered, grounding techniques help. These might include focusing on sensory experiences like the feeling of your feet on the floor or an ice cube in your hand, naming what you see around you to reconnect with the present moment, or using the 5-4-3-2-1 technique, where you identify 5 things you can see, 4 you can hear, 3 you can touch, 2 you can smell, and 1 you can taste. Processing anger is important. Many survivors initially struggle to access anger, having learned in the relationship that expressing anger was dangerous or made them the abusive one. But anger is a healthy response to violation and mistreatment. Allowing yourself to feel and express anger safely, whether through writing letters you never send, physical exercise, or discussions in therapy, helps release the energy that's been turned inward in depression or self-blame. Simultaneously, letting go of anger eventually becomes important for your own well-being. This doesn't mean forgiveness, which many survivors find neither possible nor necessary. The narcissist hasn't apologized meaningfully, hasn't changed, hasn't earned forgiveness. But at some point, continuing to focus on the narcissist, even in anger, keeps you connected to them energetically. Letting go means choosing to invest your emotional energy in your own life rather than in feelings about them. Rebuilding trust, both in yourself and others, happens gradually. You need to learn to trust your own perceptions again, to believe your gut feelings, to have confidence in your judgment. This requires challenging the self-doubt the narcissist instilled, noticing when your perceptions are accurate, and acknowledging when your intuition warns you about something that later proves concerning. Trusting others again is perhaps even harder. You trusted the narcissist, and they exploited that trust profoundly. Now everyone feels potentially dangerous. You might find yourself hypervigilant in new relationships, overanalyzing people's words and behaviors for signs of narcissistic traits, struggling to relax into connection. This is protective but exhausting. Rebuilding trust in others requires going slowly, starting with small acts of trust and seeing how people respond. Surrounding yourself with people who've proven trustworthy through consistent behavior over time, and accepting that while you can't guarantee no one will ever hurt you again, most people aren't narcissists, and healthy relationships are possible. Relearning what healthy relationships look like is essential. The narcissistic relationship taught you profoundly distorted lessons about what love means, what you can expect from partners, what's normal in conflicts, and what role you should play. Unlearning these lessons and integrating healthier relationship models takes time. Healthy relationships involve reciprocity, where both people's needs matter and are considered. They include respect, where differences of opinion don't trigger rage or contempt. They feature empathy, where both people genuinely care about and try to understand each other's experiences. They allow for autonomy, where both people maintain separate identities, interests, and relationships outside the partnership. They practice healthy conflict resolution, where disagreements are approached as problems to solve together rather than battles to win. Many survivors benefit from deliberately staying out of romantic relationships for a period during recovery. Jumping into a new relationship too quickly, before doing the necessary healing work, risks repeating patterns, attracting another narcissist, or bringing your unresolved trauma into an otherwise healthy dynamic. Taking time to be single, to become comfortable alone, to do your healing work without the complications of navigating a new relationship creates a foundation for healthier future partnerships. Recovery isn't linear. You'll have good days and bad days, periods of feeling strong and periods of feeling devastated again. You might dream about the narcissist months after going no contact, triggering a setback. You might encounter them unexpectedly and find your carefully built stability shaken. Holidays, anniversaries, or other significant dates might bring waves of grief. All of this is normal. What matters isn't avoiding setbacks, but how you respond to them. When you have a bad day, can you treat yourself with compassion rather than frustration? When you're triggered, can you use your coping skills rather than spiraling into despair? When you have a moment of missing the narcissist, can you recognize it as a trauma bond response rather than a sign you should reach out? Recovery also involves meaning making. Finding ways to integrate this experience into your life story in a way that doesn't define you but does acknowledge its significance. Some survivors become advocates, helping others recognize and escape narcissistic abuse. Some use the experience to deepen their empathy and understanding of human psychology. Some simply acknowledge that they survived something difficult and emerged stronger. The goal of recovery isn't to return to who you were before the abuse. That person no longer exists, and that's okay. You've been changed by this experience, and some of those changes are permanent. But while you can't become who you were, you can become someone new, someone with hard-won wisdom about relationships and human nature, someone with deeper compassion for others' suffering, someone with strength you didn't know you had. You can integrate this experience into your life as a chapter, painful but closed, rather than as a defining narrative that determines your future. For those in the midst of recovery, be patient with yourself. Healing from narcissistic abuse isn't a straight line from pain to wholeness. It's a winding path with detours and backtracking, with periods of despair and surprising moments of joy. With gradual progress that's sometimes only visible when you look back over months. Trust the process, even when it feels impossibly slow. You're doing the work, and that work will bear fruit, even when you can't yet see it. Section 9. Treatment for Narcissistic Personality Disorder. Having focused extensively on the experience of surviving narcissistic abuse, it's important we also address treatment for narcissistic personality disorder itself. This is a complex and somewhat controversial topic, as effective treatment for NPD remains one of the most challenging areas in mental health care. The first and perhaps most significant challenge is that individuals with narcissistic personality disorder rarely seek treatment for the disorder itself. Remember that the defensive grandiosity characterizing narcissism serves to protect against intolerable feelings of inadequacy and shame. Acknowledging that one has a personality disorder, that something is fundamentally wrong with how one relates to oneself and others, threatens this entire defensive structure. It requires admitting imperfection, vulnerability, and need for help, all of which are ego-dystonic, completely at odds with the narcissist's self-concept. When people with NPD do enter treatment, it's typically not by choice. They might be mandated by courts following legal issues, compelled by employers after workplace conflicts, given ultimatums by partners threatening to leave, or seeking help for comorbid conditions like depression, anxiety, or substance use, without recognizing the underlying personality issues. They might present complaining about others' unreasonableness, seeking validation for their victimhood, or wanting the therapist to fix their partner or boss. Even when entering treatment, engagement remains precarious. The therapeutic relationship itself challenges narcissistic defenses in multiple ways. The therapist's interpretations may feel like criticism, triggering narcissistic rage or withdrawal. The therapist's empathy may be experienced as condescending or as weakness to exploit. The therapeutic frame, those necessary boundaries around session times, fees, and the limits of the relationship, may provoke entitlement-based anger. Research on treatment outcomes for narcissistic personality disorder reveals a discouraging picture. Dropout rates are extremely high. One study found that patients with NPD had a 64% dropout rate, the highest among all personality disorders studied. The very traits that characterize the disorder, the need for excessive admiration and inability to tolerate feeling less than perfect, predict early termination. Those who do remain in treatment often show slow, gradual improvement at best. Rapid change has not been documented in the literature. Some patients remain in therapy for years, showing symptomatic reduction, reporting less depression or anxiety, experiencing more interpersonal crises, but without fundamental changes in the narcissistic personality structure itself. There are no FDA-approved medications for treating narcissistic personality disorder. Medications may be used to address comorbid conditions or specific symptoms, antidepressants for depression, mood stabilizers for emotional dysregulation, antipsychotics for transient psychotic features, or severe aggression. But these don't address the core personality pathology. One study even suggested that psychotherapy alone produced better outcomes for NPD than psychotherapy combined with medication, possibly because the medication reduced motivation for the difficult psychological work required. The primary treatment modality for NPD is psychotherapy, though various therapeutic approaches have been proposed. Psychoanalytic and psychodynamic therapies have the longest history of treating narcissistic pathology. These approaches aim to help patients understand the defensive function of their narcissism, explore the childhood origins of their personality structure, and gradually develop more realistic and integrated self-representations. Transference-focused psychotherapy, TFP, developed by Otto Kernberg and colleagues, is one specific psychodynamic approach that has shown some promise. TFP focuses on the here and now experience of the therapeutic relationship, helping patients recognize and work through the idealization, devaluation, and other primitive defenses they enact with the therapist. The idea is that by repeatedly confronting these patterns in the safe container of therapy, patients can gradually develop more mature and realistic ways of relating. Schema therapy, integrating cognitive, behavioral, and experiential techniques within a developmental framework, has also shown promise with personality disorders, including NPD. Schema therapy identifies maladaptive schemas, enduring patterns of thinking and feeling developed in childhood, and works to modify them through a combination of cognitive techniques, experiential exercises, and behavioral pattern breaking. For narcissism, relevant schemas might include defectiveness, being unlovable, and failure, which the grandiose self defends against. Mentalization-based treatment, MBT, focuses on enhancing the capacity to mentalize, to think about one's own and others' mental states, to understand behavior as driven by thoughts, feelings, and intentions. People with NPD often have impaired mentalizing, particularly regarding others' internal experiences. MBT helps develop this capacity through systematic exploration of thoughts and feelings in the therapeutic relationship and in external relationships. Cognitive behavioral therapy approaches for NPD aim to identify and challenge the distorted cognitions that maintain narcissistic patterns, beliefs about one's superiority, expectations of special treatment, attributions that blame others for all problems. CBT also works on developing empathy skills and healthier interpersonal behaviors. However, the cognitive challenging at the heart of CBT can trigger narcissistic defenses, making this approach difficult to implement. Dialectical behavior therapy, DBT, developed for borderline personality disorder, has been adapted for other personality disorders, including NPD. DBT teaches skills in mindfulness, emotion regulation, distress tolerance, and interpersonal effectiveness. For narcissists, these skills can help manage the emotional dysregulation underlying narcissistic rage, develop distress tolerance that reduces the need for constant validation, and learn more effective interpersonal behaviors. Group therapy has been proposed as potentially valuable, offering opportunities for interpersonal learning through feedback from peers, though managing narcissistic dynamics in groups presents significant challenges. The narcissist might dominate the group, devalue other members, or drop out when confronted with challenging feedback. Despite these various approaches, there's very limited research demonstrating effectiveness. There are almost no randomized controlled trials, the gold standard for treatment research, examining therapies for NPD. Most evidence comes from clinical case reports, small case series, or pre-post studies without control groups. A 2024 study that followed patients with NPD in long-term therapy, 2.5 to 5 years, found that all patients showed improvement, no longer met diagnostic criteria at completion, and showed better functioning. This suggests that change is possible with sustained treatment, but the studies on this topic remain limited. What makes treatment of NPD so difficult? Several factors contribute. First, motivation for change is typically low. Change requires acknowledging problems, tolerating shame and vulnerability, and sustaining effort over years with no guarantee of success. For someone whose entire personality is organized around avoiding exactly these experiences, the task is monumentally difficult. Second, the core defenses that maintain narcissism are exactly what need to change, but they're also what allows the person to function. The grandiose self protects against intolerable feelings of inadequacy. Giving up that defense means experiencing those feelings directly before developing healthier ways to manage them. It requires walking through the fire to get to the other side. And most people with NPD aren't willing or able to do that. Third, the therapeutic relationship itself becomes a battleground. The therapist must maintain empathy and positive regard for a patient who may be devaluing, contemptuous, or exploitative. The patient must tolerate the dependency inherent in the therapy while maintaining defenses against acknowledging need. The delicate balance required is extraordinarily difficult for both parties to sustain. Fourth, the personality patterns in NPD are deeply ingrained, developed over decades, neurobiologically embedded, and reinforced by countless interpersonal experiences. Changing such patterns requires not just insight, but sustained practice of new ways of relating, thinking, and feeling, practiced over thousands of interactions until new neural pathways are established. This is slow, difficult work. What does successful treatment look like when it does occur? Rather than eliminating narcissistic traits entirely, a more realistic goal is softening them, increasing flexibility, developing some capacity for empathy and self-reflection. The person might still have higher than average narcissistic traits, but be able to recognize them, manage them, and relate to others more genuinely. Successful treatment might mean the person develops awareness of how their behavior impacts others, shows some capacity to feel remorse when they hurt people, can tolerate criticism without extreme rage or withdrawal, maintains more stable self-esteem that's less dependent on constant external validation, forms some relationships characterized by genuine mutuality rather than pure exploitation, and shows reduced need for grandiosity as their underlying insecurity becomes more tolerable. Even these more modest goals are difficult to achieve. Most people with NPD don't reach them, either because they never enter treatment, drop out early, or remain in treatment without fundamental change. This reality is sobering, but important to acknowledge. It informs survivors that hoping the narcissists will change is usually futile. Change is theoretically possible, but practically rare, requiring years of intensive treatment that most narcissists won't pursue. Does this mean we shouldn't treat NPD at all? No. Even modest improvements in narcissistic pathology can reduce suffering, both for the individual and those around them. Some patients do benefit significantly from treatment. Research and treatment development continue. And as our understanding of the disorder deepens, more effective interventions may emerge. But it does mean that survivors shouldn't wait for the narcissist to change, shouldn't stay in abusive relationships hoping therapy will fix things, shouldn't sacrifice their well-being on the altar of the narcissist's potential for growth. The responsibility for change lies with the person who has the disorder, and most won't choose that path. Accepting this reality, painful as it is, allows survivors to focus on their own healing rather than remaining focused on the impossible task of fixing someone else. Section 10, the final revelation. We've traveled a long path together tonight, through the landscape of narcissistic personality disorder, and the profound impact it has on those who love or are related to people with this condition. We've explored diagnostic criteria and subtypes, developmental origins, and neurobiological correlates the cycle of abuse and manipulation tactics, the psychological aftermath, and the path to recovery, and the challenges of treating the disorder itself. But there's one final revelation, perhaps the most important one, that emerges when we step back and look at everything we've discussed. Here it is. The very thing that makes narcissistic abuse so devastating is also what makes human connection so precious. Think about it. Why does the idealization phase feel so intoxicating? Because deep down, we all long to be truly seen, genuinely valued, completely understood. The narcissist exploits this universal human need, weaponizing our capacity for connection. Why does gaslighting destroy us so thoroughly? Because our sense of reality depends on validation from others. We're social creatures who construct our understanding of the world partly through shared perception. When someone systematically undermines that shared reality, they're attacking the foundation of how humans make sense of their experience. Why is leaving so difficult? Because the trauma bond mimics, in distorted form, the actual biochemical and psychological processes of genuine attachment. The intermittent reinforcement that keeps victims trapped is a corruption of the normal uncertainty and variability that exists in all relationships, twisted into a tool of control. In other words, narcissistic abuse works precisely because it hijacks the mechanisms that make us human. Our need for connection, our capacity for love, our ability to trust, our desire to believe the best in others. The narcissist has discovered, though usually not consciously, how to exploit the very systems that allow human relationships to exist at all. This is why the experience is so confusing and painful. You're not responding wrongly to abuse. You're responding normally to something that mimics love so closely that distinguishing them requires tools most people don't have until after they've been hurt. And here's the deeper revelation. Understanding narcissistic abuse doesn't just teach us about a personality disorder. It reveals the architecture of human connection itself. We see in stark relief what happens when empathy is absent, when relationships become transactional, when another person is viewed as a source of supply rather than a fellow human being. We see the devastating consequences of love without mutuality, admiration without genuine respect, intimacy without vulnerability. But the inverse is equally true. Understanding what narcissistic relationships lack illuminates what healthy relationships require. Genuine empathy, not just cognitive understanding, but actual feeling with. Reciprocity, where both people's needs genuinely matter. Authentic vulnerability, where showing your real self doesn't result in it being weaponized against you. Consistent care, not intermittent reinforcement. Respect for your separate existence, not attempts to control or possess you. Every survivor of narcissistic abuse, in learning what was done to them, simultaneously learns what love actually is. Not the intensity of idealization, but the steadiness of genuine care. Not the drama of chaos and crisis, but the safety of predictability and trust. Not the desperate need to prove your worth, but the peace of being valued simply for existing. This is perhaps the most powerful form of healing. Discovering that the person who never existed taught you, through their absence, what a real person looks like. The relationship that nearly destroyed you became, ultimately, the teacher that showed you exactly what you deserve. and should accept nothing less than. For those who've survived narcissistic relationships, your confusion, your pain, your difficulty leaving, your ongoing trauma symptoms, all of this makes sense. You're not crazy, weak, or broken. You responded normally to an abnormal and deeply damaging situation. And in surviving it, in doing the work to understand and heal from it, you've gained something precious. Clarity about what genuine human connection requires and the strength to demand it. For those trying to understand someone in their life who might have narcissistic features, remember that this is a complex mental health condition, not simple selfishness or arrogance. While understanding doesn't excuse abusive behavior, it can provide context. And importantly, you cannot fix or save someone with narcissistic personality disorder. The responsibility for change, if change is to happen at all, lies with them. Your responsibility is to yourself, to recognizing abuse when it occurs, setting boundaries, and removing yourself from harmful dynamics if necessary. For mental health professionals who work with either individuals with NPD or survivors of narcissistic abuse, the challenges are significant, but the work is essential. Survivors need validation, trauma-informed care, and support in recognizing that what they experienced was abuse. Those rare individuals with NPD who do genuinely seek change need patient, boundaried therapists willing to engage in the slow work of personality transformation. Both require specialized understanding and skilled intervention. The study of narcissistic personality disorder and narcissistic abuse continues to evolve. Researchers are refining our understanding of the disorder's subtypes, exploring its neurobiological underpinnings, investigating what treatments might be effective, and documenting the specific features of narcissistic abuse and its traumatic impact. As this knowledge grows, so too does our capacity to help both those who have the disorder and those harmed by it. In the quiet of this moment, as we come to the end of our exploration, remember this: human connection is one of our most fundamental needs. And when that need is exploited by someone with profound empathy, deficits, and desperate need for validation, the wound runs deep, but the capacity for healing, for resilience, for eventually trusting and connecting again, this too is fundamental to human nature. Survivors of narcissistic abuse don't just recover, they often become some of the most empathetic, psychologically aware, and authentically connected people because they've learned, through painful experience, to distinguish real connection from its mimicry. They've developed the ability to spot manipulation, the courage to set boundaries, and the wisdom to value themselves independently of others' validation. The wound, once healed, becomes a kind of psychological immune system, protecting against future manipulation while deepening capacity for genuine intimacy. The person who never existed taught you what a real person should be. The relationship that wasn't taught you what real relationships require. And your survival has equipped you with tools that many people never develop: discernment, self-knowledge, and an unwillingness to accept less than you deserve. If you found value in this exploration, if these ideas resonate with your experience, or help you understand psychology more deeply, I invite you to like this video and subscribe to the channel. We explore psychological topics with this same combination of scientific rigor and compassionate understanding. creating space for learning, even as we drift towards sleep. Your support allows this work to continue, reaching more people who might benefit from these explorations. Let your breath deepen now. Let the information settle. Whether you came here seeking understanding of yourself, someone you love, or simply to learn about the fascinating complexity of human personality, may you carry forward whatever serves you and release the rest. Thank you for joining me in this journey through the psychology of narcissism and narcissistic abuse. Until next time, be gentle with yourself. Be patient with your healing, if healing is what you need. And remember that understanding is itself a form of power. The power to recognize, to choose differently, to move forward into the authentic connections you deserve. Rest well.